Right. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for our webinar this morning in our 2025 series of the City of Seattle hosted IPM and recertification webinars. This is the second of 3 webinars that we're offering in this series this year. My name is Kate Kurtz. I use she, her pronouns, and I'll be your facilitator this morning. I am the Organics and Landscape Resource Conservation Program Lead for Seattle Public Utilities, and I'm just one of several members of the IPM Webinar Planning Committee, which is comprised of representatives from several City of Seattle departments. So let's start this morning by going over some super brief instructions for this webinar, including how and when to submit your information to receive WSDA pesticide license and ISA arborist credits. So before we kick off this morning, I do want to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral lands and waters of the Coast Salish people, specifically here in Seattle, the Muckleshoot, Duwamish, Suquamish, and Snoqualmie, who are still here and have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. I would like to recognize and thank them before beginning this event today. Thank you. Of course, acknowledgement is just an elementary first step. And I encourage all of us to dig deeper and learn more about how to support Indigenous people of this region. At this point, Bridget, I was going to say stop. And I'd like to invite Jamie Lim to start sharing their screen. In this first presentation today, we will hear from Jamie on how data-driven approaches can be leveraged to manage the threat of emerald ash borer in urban landscapes. Jamie is the lead arborist at Seattle Parks and Recreation and an ISA board-certified master arborist with extensive experience in arboriculture and urban forestry. Jamie has worked for municipal institutions managing urban forestry in various major cities like Singapore, New York City, and now in Seattle. We're so lucky to have them. They have a wide range of experience in tree inventory management, data-driven decision-making, and implementing IPM practices to support healthy urban landscapes. And currently, the urban forestry team in SPR is developing proactive measures to protect ash trees on parks property and working with citywide urban forestry team on a collective approach to emerald ash borer management. I'm really looking forward to this presentation today. Thank you so much, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you so much for the wonderful introduction, Kate. And also, again, thank you for Bridget for the invite here. Yeah, really happy to be here to share with y'all what emerald ash borer is and what's our current practice and management plans for Seattle Parks and Recreation. So, as Kate mentioned, I'm the urban forestry manager, just a recent update in the title. And what I do at Seattle Parks as part of our urban forestry program is it's primarily focused on arboriculture operations. So we have a tree crew and that focuses on mitigation for hazard trees like pruning, removal, responding to emergency, and doing tree inspections for service requests. And we also have Trees for Seattle Parks program, which is a tree planting program focused on increasing tree canopy in Seattle parks, and that is led by an arboriculturist and for um, tree planting specialists to focus all that work in, especially in high equity areas. We also do like technical reviews for capital improvement projects, any permit reviews and development work that impacts parks property. So yeah, and right now I'll go on to share about my presentation today. So I'll first give an overall overview of what emerald ash borer is and what are the current management options and treatment strategies there are in the industry, and then go on to share about what we're doing at Seattle Parks and Recreation. So let me go ahead. So here's an introduction of what EAB is first. So emerald ash borer is this really tiny green metallic beetle that comes from East Asia, and it came here. It was discovered in the U.S. in 2002, and since then it has caused widespread like devastation of ash trees. That's the main tree species that it attacks. So it's an invasive species, and as you can see in the photo on the left, it can cause like major decline and death of ash trees, like rows and rows of them. So it's a really significant pest to urban trees. And while it's mostly widespread in the Northeast and Midwest, it's slowly starting to expand its spread. And most recently, in the last couple of years, it has been reported in Oregon and British Columbia in Canada. So in Washington and in the city of Seattle, we are basically sandwiched in between these two regions, and so we need to be prepared for this. It's probably about a matter of time that it arrives here. So yeah, that's the impact of the emerald ash borer. Um, Next, to understand what EAB is, we also need to be able to identify ash trees. So here's like a quick 101 about what ash trees are. Ash have this compound leaves. You can see here it's composed of 5 to 11 leaflets, and the leaflet margins are serrated and they are opposite to each other, like this across from each other. So it's pretty distinctive. And if you look at their buds and branches, it's normally found directly across from each other like that. So it's another distinctive feature when you look at the branching features and the leaves. Another good way to identify ash trees is the bark. On young trees, it's relatively smooth and a little bit of orange, but as they age, it becomes this gray and diamond shaped ridges like that. So it's a pretty distinctive feature of the ash trees. And also it has seeds. So these individual seeds are held in samaras like that, have a single wing, and they occur in clusters and they may stay on into the winter time. And another feature about it, which is more obvious in the fall, and also actually really like the colors of ash trees. It's super pretty. You'll see like orange, purplish hue, and there's also this version of a purple, reddish colored tree. So they're actually really pretty in the landscape. But unfortunately, with the arrival of emerald ash borer, it's a tree species that has to be replaced eventually, or have some form of a treatment to be able to preserve in the landscape. And so to understand what emerald ash borer is, we also need to know the life cycle. And as with any IPM management strategy, it's also important to understand what is the pest that you're managing, because you need to know the different stages of its life cycle. That way we can know what is its mode of action in terms of infesting a particular tree or any other IPM aspect of it. And the reason is because we need to know when is the best time to be able to apply treatment, or to be most effective in our management program. So here's an overview of what the emerald ash borer cycle is like. I'll start off with over here, sometime in October to March. What happens is the EAB eggs hatch into larvae, and they create these ash-shaped corridors to tunnel through the ash bark, and that's what they're feeding on. So you see this tunneling here. I'll go over later, but that's one of the distinctive features to identify presence of EAB in the tree. So this tunneling is also what causes the tree to die and go into decline, because it's tunneling through the live tissues of the tree just underneath the bark. And that's where all the live tissues are. It's the vascular tissues that the tree uses to transport water and minerals. So once that's damaged, imagine basically your transport system is blocked. And so the tree isn't able to uptake its essential materials. And so therefore it eventually dies. And it's also a reason why for emerald ash borer, when a tree gets infested, it dies very quickly and it makes the wood really brittle, and it can become a hazard to public safety and even to arborists working in the trees. And next would be sometime April. So EAB larva enters the pupa stage to transform into an adult EAB beetle. And sometime in the late May, so when they finally turn into this adult, they leave the ash bark, and that's where you see D-shaped exit holes. Again, this would be another sign of EAB, to be able to identify the presence of it. And with that, the adults leave, they feed on the ash trees, they mate, and the females lay eggs around 3 to 4 weeks before dying and starting the life cycle again. And so that would be sometime in May to September, laying the eggs in the crevices of the trees. So this one would highlight, woodpeckers would be attacking the tree, feeding on it, and so that's another sign of EAB. So with that, um, how do we observe for EAB? Knowing now that we know the life cycle, we know what are some of the signs of EAB of the pest damage. And so the Minnesota Department of Agriculture has a really good EAB visual inspection guide. You can go online to look for that. It shows pictures and a description of what it looks like. And so with observing for EAB, one of the things that we would do is to use a binoculars, a really powerful binoculars, so that you can observe for any D-shaped exit holes or any of these signs from the ground. Sometimes they may be pretty high up in the canopy, and so using the binoculars would be helpful in tracking and monitoring, which is again part of an IPM management program to be able to track and manage the pests that you are working on. So next would be looking at the EAB signs and symptoms. As I mentioned earlier, based on the life cycle, what we would see. So here in the first picture, this is the S-shaped tunneling that I was mentioning earlier. So one of the features of EAB presence is you notice some bark popping out of the tree, and that is a sign that there could be something going on underneath. Bark can pop up in typically under a tree, depending on what there might be some structural issues with the tree. But what is distinctive about EAB is that underneath the bark, you'd see this tunneling as well as the D-shaped exit holes here. So this is an example of it, like D like this instead of round. And they're really small, and so this could be also high up in the canopy, and that's where using the binoculars would be helpful. So, and then of course, observing for the beetles themselves, um, really like greenish metallic. They're actually really pretty underneath, and this kind of colorful body here. But this is not commonly seen. It's only usually the case for very severe infestation in the landscape. But otherwise, they're often really hard to spot. And there's a very distinctive features of the larvae itself. They have these two mouthpiece, and that is what they're using to do the tunneling to that this damage. And of course, some of the symptoms would be, the tree decline. Um, as I mentioned in the life cycle where I covered like how the tunneling affects the vascular tissues of the tree. So we'd often see like this significant crown dieback. So crown dieback, as its name suggests, it's dying back from the tips first, and very often the upper canopy of the tree crown would be like defoliated, and you see more green material on the lower part of the canopy. Another distinctive one would be at the base area, it's like very vigorous sprouting. It's kind of the tree giving its last push to be able to survive, and so therefore that basal sprouting at the base. So then again, as I mentioned with the woodpecker damage, this is an example of what it might look like. So the woodpeckers like scratching, trying to look for beetles to feed on. Again, this can occur in, generally in trees as when you walk in the woods, sometimes you hear like woodpecker pecking on trees. Again, but what is distinctive for EAB is that underneath that pecking, the woodpecker damage, you see like generally a hole and also really light wood material. The lighter the wood it is, it means that it's the live tissues. Sometimes it can be darker, so that's dead or older tissues. Yeah. So, being able to understand and look out for, know what's the EAB signs and symptoms, it's important to, as practitioners, to be able to detect and identify the presence of EAB in our landscapes. And that's also one of the first steps to take to know that we have a pest here and what's the subsequent actions that we need to take. All right, so next would be looking at, now that we've covered what are the, what EAB is, how do you identify them. The next step is looking at what are the current best practices in EAB management. So here is an example. Here is yeah, this study is by McCullough and McCarter. It's the slow ash mortality approach, or otherwise known as SLAM. The goal of this is to reduce EAB numbers and the growth of EAB population. So let's see, it's a study that's done by researchers in Michigan where they looked at the various combinations of management strategies, and they found that the most effective one is a site-based approach that integrates different management options based on the characteristics of an infested site, and that will increase the success of EAB response within the urban tree canopy. So basically, SLAM management includes a variety of combinations of treatment and mitigation actions. So examples would be like it's basically a combination of girdling, debarking ash trees, known as trap trees, which I'll cover later, and then the application of insecticide treatment, and finally selectively removing ash trees. So, and they found that, this is a simulation that they run with various forms of treatment, and they found that um, the method of 20%, treating 20% of your ash trees would give you a protection of 99% of ash trees in 10 years. And it also shows that the cumulative cost of treatment is much lower than removing dead or severely declining ash trees reactively. So as I mentioned about trap trees earlier, this is what it looks like, and this is some forms of a detection method. So trap trees is where you select low value ash trees and girdle them, debarking them. Doing so is it's like killing the tree basically. And the reason for this is that stress trees typically attract pests more because they give out some form of pheromones that insects are attracted to, and that is also a reason why when you're managing like plants and trees and the landscape, it's good practice to keep your trees healthy, have a healthy tree canopy, and making them more resilient to infestations. So with this, like debarking the ash trees, you're basically stressing some trees to be able to attract the EAB to these trees instead of another random ash tree in the landscape. And on the right here is an example of a trap. So this is a sticky trap that you can hang in the tree. Basically, it's like a film of sticky material that, whenever an insect passes through or flies through, it gets trapped. And so therefore, looking at it, you know like what kind of insects are on the tree. So just to share an experience of this, I interned at the Arnold Arboretum before, and I was working with the tree crew, so they were hanging all these traps too in the garden. So it's really interesting. I got to be able to see what it looked like, climbing the tree to put them up. So yeah, so some cities or institutes have also used this as part of their monitoring strategy. Next, I'll talk about what are the current treatments for EAB. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, using systemic insecticides, so chemical treatment. And I found this table that summarizes chemical control options for EAB it's from the Oregon Department of Forestry and the Department of Agriculture. It's part of the EAB readiness plans for Oregon. They did a pretty good summary of what the management strategy is in Oregon. And I thought this is a really good table to summarize what are the different forms of chemical control. So right now we have trunk injection, soil drainage trunk spray, or foliar spray. And it also highlights what are the active ingredient in these injections or applications, as well as the efficacy, who can apply it, and what is the target stage of the insect. So again, recap of life cycle. That's why it's important to know life cycle of the pest that you're managing, so that you know what is the appropriate treatment method you need to apply. The most common method that practitioners use right now is the trunk injection. So many cities, again, institutes are using this trunk injection. That's because it's the most effective so far. You can see that it has excellent level of control, 1 to 3 years. On average, people are using about 2 years of a cycle. So what happens in the trunk injection? So the photo on the right is what it looks like. So basically, some holes are drilled into the base of the tree, and then they inject it with these tubes and the chemical. And so how it works is basically as the tree transpires. So with the leaves of the tree, that's where exchange of gases is. So you can imagine the live tissues of the tree to be like tons of straws around the tree, and it's the exchange of gases between the leaves. It's like a suction. It's a suction, and it pulls up water, minerals up these straws, let's say, and then with the injection of these into the vascular tissues, it's also uptaking the insecticide into the tree. So yeah, really interesting method of application. The other soil drainage trunk spray are not as common, and yeah, they don't have as good efficacy. And also, the advantage of having the trunk injection is that you don't get chemical, um, outside of the landscape, as compared to like having a soil drainage or trunk spray. And next, I'll touch on biological control as part of IPM program, there's always an aspect of biological control, using natural predators to control the pests that you're working on. So for EAB, there are 4 tiny stingless wasps. They're not as effective to suppress EAB population, mostly used in natural areas. And yeah, that's because with biological control, one of the things is that it often takes a while to be able to see that effect. Um, the biological control themselves has to establish up to a certain number of population to be able to have that the effect of a natural suppression to its prey. So while the advantage is that you're not using any chemicals, yeah, but it takes a while, and EAB infests, it can come and impact the tree too fast. And so for the most part, it's still using chemical treatments for EAB. And of course, another strategy would be to remove and replace. Well, because eventually, as EAB will affect um, all ash trees, so proactively, selectively removing ash trees ahead of time helps to manage the number of trees that arborists or tree management companies would have to manage once the trees die. And a strategy is also to proactively replace tree planting in the urban landscape with alternative tree species. So ash tree species, it's one that's not being planted anymore in the landscape, selecting alternative tree species. And with removal, also, managing public spaces is also important to put out messaging and signs. That's because tree removal can be sensitive depending on the area that you're in, and also to be accountable to the public as we're managing, especially for public management, we're managing public assets. So this is an example of putting out messaging out on a tree to inform the public of why a tree is being removed. And it's also part of education to let people know of, well, this is an ash tree, it needs to be removed. And then this is a pretty good example of a sign. It also highlights to people what they should do, help slow the spread, don't move firewood. Um, yeah, and then with the large amount of removals that's anticipated in Amarash borer infestation, then there comes a problem of having, a lot of wood waste. So imagine rows and rows of ash trees that die in the city, and then as the tree companies have to remove them, there's a lot of wood waste. And where do you store all these wood waste? Some of the trees, especially in areas where you have like really mature ash trees, would have really large wood, and that can be chipped. They have to be stored in storage yards, and so these will pile up, and then becomes an issue of wood management as well. So, and a fun fact about ash trees, they're actually really good lumber wood. Very pretty. The wood grain is pretty, and they have a nice color to it. So it's actually really useful wood. It's a wood of choice in terms of making furniture, and here's an example of like making a bench out of it. And another way is to also use it as to make baseball bats. It's one of the material to make that. And so looking at creative ways to be able to reuse this wood in terms of when there's emerald ash borer in an area. So coming up with different strategies on how we can reuse and recycle the wood. Um, Currently, there is in Oregon, there is a city that is able to also get an incinerator. They were able to incinerate that into biochar. Again, that's very useful material, and gets to you can use that back in the landscape. And so, being able to manage EAB will also be looking at the management of wood waste, coming up with creative ways, looking for partnerships with local wood makers or schools to be able to come up with a way that they could reuse this wood instead of having them all go into disposal. So that pretty much covers what are the different management options and treatments for EAB. And so here is an overview of what the model EAB management strategy is. So in short, it's easy to remember: save the best, replace the rest. And it comprises of these 7 components of what an effective management strategy would be. So the first would be to maintain an accurate assessment and records, an updated city code in terms of managing EAB. And so that's where we'll look at why is having data important in EAB management. It's also important generally in any IPM management program. And be able to detect infestation as early as possible. So that's, having staff and public be aware and informed of what EAB is, what it looks like. And so, it can be a collective effort among everybody to look out for all these signs and symptoms of EAB infestation. And being able to detect that early, it would help in suppressing the pest pressure. And of course, postpone and decrease peak ash mortality, preserving the most valuable ash trees. And this is where I'll talk about how we will be selecting ash trees to preserve, to treat, and selectively removing the rest. Next is to expand the tree canopy, improve tree diversity, and that's also a very important strategy in urban tree management. We want to always have a more diverse tree palette instead of a monoculture, as we've learned from previous experiences. Example, emerald ash borer, and also Dutch elm disease. When you have a monoculture, like rows of a similar tree species, once a pest comes, it can quickly, cause massive death of rows and rows of trees. So it becomes a very huge management lift for a lot of municipalities. Minimize public costs, and also to enlist private ash owners to manage their trees to being consistent with management plans. So here is looking at using data to make informed decision making and management strategies. And as I mentioned earlier, the importance of using data is so that we can be accountable for what we have, know what we have, and then make plans, do analysis to project out what it might look like for future treatment, what's the cost of treatment, and then plan out for how we can implement our management strategy. And so here's an example, as part of the 7 components of the model EAB management is also one is having accurate data records and data management. And it always begins with having a tree inventory. So on the left is what a tree inventory looks like. So basically, a tree inventory is like you can almost describe it as like a checklist or account of what you have as a tree manager, like what what are the number of trees that you have, how many trees you have in the area that you're managing, what are the tree species, what in this example, they look at crown diameter. Most commonly, they look at the diameter at standard height of the tree, the height of the tree, some basic information. What are the condition of the tree? Are they healthy, not healthy, dead or alive? So these are basic information. So, and it's a spatial map where it shows you what are the trees you have and where they are located. And so having a spatial map is very important to be able to visualize where the different tree species are, and it helps with looking at logistics and planning out for any management plans that you have. And using iTree2, this is a software produced by the USDA Forest Service, and it's able to do a lot of analysis with the information of tree assets that you have. So, for example, looking at like quantifying ecoservices of a tree, they're able to give like a value dollar for um, the dollar amount of what a tree, how much eco service it's providing for the city. And so using that as a tool to be able to project out value that trees bring. And it's often really important to be able to justify that, making a case and showing that when you are trying to pursue grant funding, or pursue any funding, projecting that to management, um, being able to quantify all these services that trees can provide into a dollar amount. And some other use of data management is also doing predictive modeling. So this is an example of a study in Michigan where they use like a modeling framework. So predictive modeling is basically a statistical tool that uses past patterns and they put it into a form of an algorithm to be able to predict out future patterns. And so this study is looking at infestation patterns. So for example, they develop an algorithm that they currently observe it's spreading at this rate. Um, it also looks at what's the mode of action of EAB. So it's looking at, for example, EAB spreads basically by wood products through wood. Basically, how it spreads is also by flight itself. Campgrounds is one of them, and it calculates, a lot of factors in to be able to project out where it might potentially spread. So this is a method of using data to be proactive in management. So with that, here's another example of EAB pathways map. So again, using that information, using spatial maps, spatial data, looking at where are the high risk areas. So again, EAB generally spreads through transportation. Transport. The main mode that it's spreading right now is yeah, with transportation, and of course, so that's why if you look at the map here, the high risk area is highlighted in red, and that's you can see that it's on the major travel ways or highways. So understanding that and then looking at basically knowing where the potential movement of EAB is. And with that, so another important thing to note about what you can do as an individual would be to be able to manage firewood. Basically, stick to that buy it where you burn it strategy, and don't move firewood. And that's the really important messaging generally to everybody. So buy it where you burn it. And of course, as landowners, again, also being quarantining your wood. So if you have EAB infested wood, don't move them. Keep quarantine them in within the location that it's found. And the next thing is also reporting what do you do as an individual if you might see something. In Washington, that would be to report to the Washington Invasive Species Council. So if you go to their website, they have this, you can report it online. There's an app. If you suspect something, you can, get in touch with them. They can have somebody come down and do an assessment. They can check on it to make sure that it is really EAB or not. So they are a really supportive resource to help, and they also have a ton of information about what invasive insects are. There is also the USDA Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. So they have a phone number that you can report this out to. So reporting is important, to be able to um, share and again, as part of the seven the core management strategy or the model EAB management is to be able to identify and detect it early to be able to suppress the effort. So again, it's a collective effort, looking not just in the city but region wide and in Washington. Um, the earlier it's being spotted, the faster we can take action to be able to manage this pest. So with that, I've pretty much covered, give an overview of what EAB is, what it looks like, what is its impacts, its implications, and what are the management strategies and options, and what you can do. So the next section here, I'm going into what we're doing in the city of Seattle, specifically at SPR. Um, how are we preparing for this? And so with that I will move on to give a brief introduction of what the urban forestry in the city of Seattle is. So, Seattle Parks and Recreation is one of 9 city departments within the city of Seattle that manages urban forestry. So, Seattle Parks and Recreation, we basically manage the green spaces on parks property, and other major city departments would be like the Seattle Department of Transportation, Seattle Public Utilities, and also the Seattle City Light. They each have their own jurisdiction of management, and it's overall collectively managed under we work together at a citywide level in the urban forestry core team, where we have representatives from each of the city departments, and that is the overall effort is being led by the Office of Sustainability and Environment under Urban Forestry Policy Advisor. So there is that collective effort at the citywide level to collaborate and work on urban forestry. So with that, I'll go into what are the land areas, or the management areas of Seattle Parks and Recreation. So basically, here's an example of some of the parks areas in Seattle SPR. We manage developed parks, so that is like an example of a park with play areas, play facilities, like this one on the top, that's Jefferson Park. And we also have boulevards, which is a very interesting feature here. It's an Olmsted design. It's called the Emerald Necklace. So basically, boulevards are they were designed originally to be able to connect parks and in terms of a green belt. So this is Lake Washington Boulevard, and as you all might be familiar, it's very pretty stretch right by the water. Um, very frequently used as a recreational path for cycling, like pedestrian, walking, running, and it's a beautiful stretch of area with a lot of like street trees. So that's an area that we manage. And there are several other boulevards like Queen Anne Boulevard that's also under our management. And of course, we also have natural areas, and that is something that I personally really like about Seattle Parks, having the natural areas giving you this like escape into nature just within the city. And that is managed by our Green Seattle Partnership team, our ecology team. So urban forestry in SPR is jointly managed by 2 teams. One is the team that I'm overseeing that focuses on the arboriculture operations. So the tree crew manages, any tree that they need to work on, with whether it's in developed parks or boulevards or in the natural areas. And our Green Seattle partnership team has a natural areas crew that they do focus more on like forest restoration, and working with forest stewards and community groups. They also have contracted services that do blackberry removal in the natural landscapes. So this is the area that we're managing. So basically about 6,410 acres that's acquired by parks. It's about 11% of the city's landmass and about 2,750 acres of natural areas. And so we have a pretty significant amount of land that we're managing. So that's a lot of trees to manage in citywide. So I'll first cover what we're doing with ash management in the natural areas. So the strategy for managing EAB in natural areas and developed parks is really different. So the Oregon ash is the native ash species. It's of significant cultural and ecological value here. There's only a pretty small number of these tree species, and in the natural area right now, we're mostly leaving it as it is, because pesticide application is pretty much restricted in the riparian zones, and these Oregon ash are typically found in these areas. Um, it's from the ecological perspective, to be able to retain these ash trees in forest stands for natural selection of resistant trees. So some places have in the ecological realm of things, they're trying to collect these seeds and grow them as natural future resistant species. So it's based off of the idea of how of evolution, basically, as living things reproduce, and based on the environmental pressure, they will develop from some form of resistance, and so naturally selecting like resistant species and then growing them, collecting the seeds and growing them. So that's for ash management in the natural areas. But we're mostly focused on the ash management in developed parks. That's because in developed parks we have a significant number of ash trees. They are larger size, and because it's in the public, they can pose a risk to the public. And as I mentioned earlier, remember how in the life cycle, the EAB can damage the vascular tissues of the tree, and once a tree is infected with EAB, the wood actually becomes really brittle again. So it becomes, once the tree dies and it's confirmed EAB, it's really, the wood is brittle and it can break, and it can be a potential risk to the public, and increases the risk of the tree over time. And also we look at any high value ash trees, to be able to selectively treat and preserve. Again, if you remember the 7 core management strategies, one is to save the best, replace the rest. So basically that's it. Select the high value ash trees, or trees that we feel like would contribute a significant canopy coverage to or utility to the park and to the community. And of course, looking at tree replacement. So I'm going into some EAB preparedness that we're starting to work on, and at this point, I really want to give the kudos out to the urban forestry team who has been working on this. Um, Staff like Mark Malone, Emily Hansen, and Tony Egging, they are our leads in the urban forestry team, and they've really put in the effort to look at our tree inventory, coming up with a condition matrix. So, looking at what are some of the criteria that we want to select our ash trees for retention or to remove them, and planning out how we are going to phase out the ash trees. And the map on the left, again, is also thanks to Danielle Devrier, who's our senior environmental analyst for the Green Seattle Partnership, who works very closely with us, supporting any GIS or analysis that we have for urban forestry. So again, what we're doing overall is looking at our tree inventory, looking at what we have, and then planning out what are the next steps with Emer Ash Borer. So again, the number one thing is to have accurate record of data and knowing what you have. So basically, again, first step in the 7 core management strategy would be to have a tree inventory, know what we have, and that's important to understand the risk of any potential infestation. So this is a screenshot of SPR's tree inventory. We are using this, it's an Azure field map. So the icons are what are the trees that has been plotted and what are the next step of a work. So for example, if it's an X, oh, that tree needs to be removed. With a leaf shape, it's a tree that needs to be pruned. And we also have a dashboard. Dashboard is really helpful to pull out metrics to be able to know what are the work that needs to be done, and it's important for reporting and presenting information. And so I wanted to share the process of what we did so far with the inventory. So our tree inventory isn't a complete one yet at this point. It's mostly based off of when we are called out to inspect a tree, then a tree gets plotted and added to the inventory. So it's still more of a reactive system. And with that, we don't have a complete 100% of ash trees. So I think in terms of EAB management, one thing is even if you don't have a complete inventory of all trees that you're managing, minimally you should have a count of how many ash trees that you have. So we started off with this intern work, hiring 2 interns last 2 years ago, and to map out what are the ash trees, where are the rest of the ash trees that we have. Initially, we only had about 400 ash trees in the inventory, and with the 2 interns, they were able to add double that amount to a total of 800 over ash trees that we have now. They were able to visit like over 300 parks and add a large amount of data to this. And also really appreciated their help because they also took this a step further and be able to analyze that data. They broke down the ash trees by condition. So it's important to understand the number of ash trees that you have and what is the current condition of them, because we want to be able to treat the ones that are in good condition and remove those that are poor. If they are in decline, there's no point in saving them, and it's better to remove and replace. This is the other inventory data that they worked on. They basically used Excel to be able to build out filters. And so that's another, Excel is a great tool to be used in any management planning or analysis. It's you can do a lot of filters and do like analysis and reporting out breakdowns of counts, and that again helps to look at projecting out how many ash trees that potentially we will need to treat, and again that would impact like the amount of budget that we need. So yeah, I wanted to give credit to Mark Malone, our crew lead here, who came up with this. He went through our inventory and looked at which are the trees that should be retained and treated or not, and then what if they were to be removed. How are they going to be removed? Whether is it by climbing or equipment or breaking that down. Again, the reason is because once a tree is infested with EAB, the wood is brittle and it becomes a complication for um, tree to be removed by arborists, especially if there is no access to equipment. So for example, if a tree needs to be climbed, an infested tree with EAB is not safe for climbing, because the wood's going to be able to break really easily, and that's going to be a safety hazard for the climber. So for these trees, we'll need to phase them out as early as we can. So proactively looking at our inventory and identifying these trees first is important to be able to select them and remove them ahead of time. And so we're also looking at a treatment criteria of 15 to 20 miles. That's the recommended range. Once EAB is detected around this range of the city, that's where treatment is recommended to begin. We also look at condition, its significance or value. So if there is a tree that's iconic to a certain park, or it's providing a significant amount of shade and utility to park users or the public, then it's something to invest in terms of long-term preservation. And we're using the DSH size of about 12 inches and more as treatment criteria. And with that, it's still a work in progress to continue to pursue the effort. Right now, we're trying to proactively inspect the amount of ash trees that we have, select to make sure that you're verifying them on the ground to make sure that they are indeed alive, in good condition, and worth injecting to save them, and working towards building out a budget for this potentially an added load to our program. Another way to look at using data to make management decisions is this urban forest pest readiness playbook that's developed by the Washington Invasive Species Council. It's a really good playbook, and there's an online resource too. So basically, what this is that it's a tool that you can do a self-assessment as a person, as a manager for an area that you have or municipality. It goes through a set of like questions and it guides you to assess on what you have, what's the capacity that you have to be able to make a response, and with that, what should you do um, to be able to be more ready for an invasive pest. So I did just did a quick play of this tool, and did a self-assessment and to understand. So basically, once when you go into this playbook, there is a set of criteria and questions that they will ask you, and you would be able to give each one a score, and ultimately it will give you this final score that lets you know where you are. So for example, this is an example of a scorecard, understanding risk. um, so for example, I did this assessment and scored ourselves as having 13 out of 21, and then you would see the benchmark here. If you're more than 13, means that you're good in terms of the resources that you have to understand the pests, and so one of that is having a good tree inventory record. So what we might need to improve is having this capacity to support a response, um, having enough resources to be able to be deployed to manage that infestation. So this is a really good tool to again, landowners and managers, municipal managers, to be able to do a self-assessment and look at what you currently have and what are the next steps to be more prepared for an invasive pest. So it's a really good resource to use. And so that pretty much concludes what I have. And I wanted to make an acknowledgement to these people who have really shaped like and started working on the EAB preparedness for SPR, from our urban forestry team. That would be Emily Henson, our arboriculturist, Mark Malone, Tony Egging, and Gabe and Josh, our urban forestry interns. Thanks to them for putting in all the ash trees and going out to hunt for all the ash trees. And also our ecology, or the Green Seattle Partnership team, Bridget, again, for organizing this. And again, thank you for the invite. And Bridget is also the lead for developing this IPM pest tracking app that we are using at SPR, and also potentially that's going to be adopted at the citywide level, where everybody can track the pests that they're managing. Again, it's all going to be mapped out spatially, so everybody can see that information. Danielle Devere, who's been really supportive, a great partner in for urban forestry, helping us with a lot of GIS management and mapping. Eric Sterner, plant ecologist, and Lisa Seco for their inputs in terms of managing EAB in the natural areas. So yeah, thank you all again. It's really ultimately EAB management, and as I summarized, in any IPN management, it's a collective effort. So everybody would have to do your part. Being all eyes on the ground, looking out for EAB, understanding what it is, being aware, and doing your part in not moving firewood. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much again for being here, and this is my contact information. If feel free to reach out if you like to connect. Yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jamie.
All right.
That was super informative and fascinating, and honestly makes me feel better about, um, the city and our response and everything that you guys are doing to prepare for the inevitable here.
We have about 8 minutes for questions, and then I recorded all the ones that were asked. So if not, I will send them along to Jamie too to see if they can answer via email in a response later. So to get started on questions, the first question we have here is, can you talk about the level and extent of control of pesticide and how often it's needed to reapply, and how long will the tree live once treated?
So it's being applied. You can apply for every 2 years, or at most 3 years. So that's the current efficacy cycle for trunk injections. So just based off of my own experience, I when I used to work in Central Park, that was the rate of application that we're using for the ash trees there every 2 years. And in the city of New York, that's what they're applying to. um and yeah, it lasts for pretty long, the coverage. It's so far it's been effective. It has, once a tree is being treated, you have to be consistent with it. So you have to make sure that you're on track with the every 2 years, and that's where having like a good inventory, good record of your application, where you have applied to, is important to be able to track that. Yep.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. Do predictive models give us a rough estimate of when we can expect EAB presence in Seattle or in the region more generally?
Yeah, it can potentially help us with that. Again, that's looking at patterns, but you need to have a good algorithm. So that's often the key. And I wish I was a statistical wizard, but I'm not. So that's a totally different um, research strategy. But yeah, potentially it could be helpful in that way.
Mm-hmm. And maybe just to be more specific, they're asking like, do we know when we may expect it, or is it just sort of like a
Yeah, from a not at this point, but it could
mm-hmm,
already even be here. So the thing about EAB is sometimes it could be present in the environment already, but it might take like a 3 or 4 years, a few years before the actual signs of infestation come up. So at this point, it might be hard to say, but we could guess that maybe just based off of the pattern that there's infestation noted in Oregon and in British Columbia, that is like pretty close by. So yeah, it's hard to say at this point.
thank you. What is the maximum documented time frame after EAB has killed a tree that either the adults or the eggs remain viable in the phloem and xylem?
Oh, sorry, could you repeat that?
What is the maximum documented time frame that after a tree has died from EAB that the adults or the eggs remain viable in the phloem and xylem?
um yeah, I don't know if there is a maximum documented time
Hmm.
that they remain viable. um but once a tree dies, it it can continue to be there, and because it can continue to live and like hatch
Hmm.
eventually. So that's where it continues to spread.
Hmm.
That's why it's important to be able to, once a tree dies, it's important to immediately chip up the wood and or dispose them, quarantine them somewhere. That's because we need to get rid of the eggs that's within the wood.
Yeah, maybe as long as there's a food source for the eggs and
Hmm.
viable habitat for the EAB.
Yep.
With the SLAM approach slide you shared implied that about 20% of the ash needs to be treated, but the plan for Seattle trees seems to show plans to treat over 50% of the ash trees. Could you elaborate on the reasoning here?
I think that again depends on the management approach, and what is the priority of people managing, the land, and what your goals are out of a management plan. So while it's recommended 20%, the reason why we're looking at 50% is, again, we're looking at some of the criteria we're looking at is also the impact of having trees to preserve to contribute to that canopy. So for example, in the city of Seattle, it's also a priority for us to retain tree canopy. We want to have as much canopy as we have. In terms of account wise, about 800 trees is not a, a lot compared to other cities, but these trees that exist would be still important in the parks to be able to provide some form of a shade. And so another way is that one approach is also to be able to treat this a larger amount so that you suppress that infestation. So imagine treating a larger amount of trees first, so there's a lower chance of them declining and dying. So that way you can um, face the removal of ash trees. So let's say we're treating 50% first, and then eventually slowing down that treatment, and then selectively remove. So it's a way to also manage the load of the death of ash trees, and also the load of having tree crews being able to handle removing that amount of dead trees, because would be only one aspect of the multitude of work that we're also handling in terms of managing trees for other risk and emergencies.
Hmm. Do you recommend that private landowners not plant ash anymore? And since a lot of Seattle street trees are the responsibility of homeowners, is it the SPR public education? Is there SPR public education on ash borer?
Yeah, so the recommendation now is not to plant ash trees.
Hmm.
At Seattle Parks, we are also not planting ash trees anymore. And the reason is because, if planting more, basically you're adding more stress or load to a potential infestation.
Hmm.
And if the young tree is not going to survive anyway, then that's also a waste of resources. And at the citywide level, we're also trying to put together a list of recommended tree species, and eventually that would be rolled out. And yes, also working on public messaging and education on what EAB might look like.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And maybe this will be the last one. We'll see if we have more time. But does EAB prefer specific ash trees, or does it target all ash trees pretty much equally? Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much all ash trees equally. It's among they mostly target the ash trees, and some of the other trees in this similar family an example would be the olive trees too, but
Hmm.
mostly the ash trees.
Hmm. Mostly ash. Cool.
Mhm.
And then how do wasp species with the biological control, how do wasp species affect the mentioned local bee populations?
Local bee populations, is that what you said?
Yeah, local bee. It says honeybee here, but I'm gonna just open it up for
Oh, okay.
all bees.
um well, I'm it hasn't really been implemented, at least not to my knowledge of introducing that in the urban landscapes.
Hmm.
So that's something that, yeah, I'm not really familiar with. I need to probably look into that a bit more.
Yeah.
I could respond in an email
Hmm.
for that one.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jamie. It's about our time for the first presentation. For any questions I didn't answer, I'll make sure to get them recorded and send them along via
All right.
email. So
Thank
I'll
you.
hand it back to Kate. Thank y'all. Yep.
Great. Thank you so much, you guys. That was wonderful, Jamie. I really appreciate that. Let's get started with our next presentation. I would like to introduce Erin Anderson of the Xerces Society to discuss the risks pesticides pose to pollinators in urban landscapes. So Erin works with the public and Xerces staff to reduce pesticide use in residential landscapes, including promoting alternative pest control measures and pollinator-friendly gardening practices. Prior to joining Xerces in 2022, he researched pollinator conservation in urban landscapes, restored habitat for several endangered butterfly species. That's cool, Erin. And worked in insect biocontrol. Erin has a PhD from Oregon State University. I am really looking forward to hearing your presentation this morning. Thanks, Erin.
Thank you so much, Kate. I appreciate that. Let me share my screen. Does that look all right?
Yeah, that looks perfect.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Kate, and thank you all so much for having me today. And thanks to Bridget for inviting me and organizing this. As Kate said, my name is Aaron Anderson, and I'm a pesticide program specialist at the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. And yeah, I'm really excited to speak to you all about pesticide risks to pollinators with a particular focus on exposure routes and how kind of understanding those fits into a integrated pest management framework. So before I begin, I want to quickly thank all of our Xerces supporters, just because without them, we couldn't do the work that we do. And on that note, I do want to add that we are a donor-supported nonprofit, so if you aren't already a member and if you're at all interested, I encourage you to kind of check us out and become a member if you're able. You'll be joining an extraordinary group of people who are really engaged and inquisitive and truly care about protecting invertebrates. And again, we couldn't do the work we do without our members. So if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society before, and if this is your first webinar with a Xerces speaker, we've been around since 1971, working to protect wildlife through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. And our name is a reference to the Xerces blue butterfly, which is believed to be the first American butterfly to go extinct due to human development. And it used to live in the coastal sand dunes around the San Francisco area. And we do a variety of on-the-ground conservation work. We have programs focusing on pollinators and agricultural biodiversity. We work on pesticide reduction, that's the team I'm on, and we do a lot of community engagement work in residential communities. We really work in all sorts of areas, and this slide here kind of has some representative photos of those areas. We have people doing freshwater mussel work, which is really cool, something I honestly don't know much about. We have this cool X-Kids program for grade school kids. And then, yeah, we have people working to install habitat on farms and in all sorts of different areas. But perhaps the most helpful work I think we do is writing detailed science-based guides for protecting pollinators and all sorts of other invertebrates. And I just want to give a quick plug. You can visit our website for free national as well as regional resources on plants, pollinators, all sorts of things. And this library is really decades of work, and it has great resources. So I encourage you all to go check it out at xerces.org. It's all free. There's materials related to what we're talking about today with pesticide reduction and IPM, as well as pollinator habitat plant selection, endangered species conservation, and much, much more. So please feel free to go check that all out. So I want to give a quick outline of where we're going with the talk today, just to kind of all be on the same page. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about pesticide risks, and then talk a bit about pollinator life histories, just because it's really important to understand life histories to then fully kind of grasp exposure routes, which will be the next section of the talk. And then we'll kind of discuss how this fits into an integrated pest management framework. So before we dive into, I guess, the more meat of this talk, I do want to spend a slide talking about why this matters. So I'm sure most of you are, kind of aware of insect and pollinator declines, but, many recent studies are documenting declines in insect populations and communities worldwide. And in particular, many pollinators, including bees and butterflies, are imperiled. One estimate is that 40% of invertebrate pollinator species may be facing extinction. And the data is patchy since many insects, in fact, most insects aren't carefully monitored. We have almost 4,000 bee species native to North America, and most of those, there's just not people out there monitoring all of them. But the data that we do have almost all points to decreases in populations around the world. And we know enough to know that it's essential to take action to conserve these pollinators as well as other insects. And there's several causes that scientists agree on, with the largest being habitat loss. But another leading cause is what we're talking about today, which is pesticides. So I do want to note that 98% of insects, is the estimate, are pests. This might kind of catch people by surprise given how much attention pest species get, but only an estimated 2% of all insects cause either economic damages or health damages to people. And all of the others are really vital as food for other species. They recycle nutrients, they contribute to pest control, and they also, of course, pollinate. I also want to emphasize that the idea of a pest is really a human construct. It represents something that humans don't want in our spaces. But outside of areas where there is conflict with humans, there might not be a problem at all. So, an example is mice in the woods are great, but mice in our buildings, we don't like that as much. And 1 billion pounds of pesticides are used each year in the United States. And this use is, as I mentioned, a major cause of pollinator declines. Bee kills from pesticides have been widely reported, but even when they don't directly kill pollinators, most pesticides also cause these subtle negative effects that can slowly result in population declines, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So a depressing case study of how pesticide use in cities and towns can have these kind of far-ranging unintended consequences took place in 2013 when over 50,000 bumblebees were poisoned in a shopping center parking lot in Wilsonville, Oregon, shown here on this slide, by a spray from a private applicator. All of those little dots on the screen on the parking lot, on the asphalt, unfortunately are all dead bumblebees. And the application that killed them was made to parking lot trees aimed at killing aphids that were dripping honeydew. It's that sticky substance that you sometimes get on your car or on the sidewalk in the summer. It's just kind of sticky sugar, essentially, that they're exuding. And these linden trees were flowering, which means when the applicator sprayed the toxic neonicotinoids, which were the chemicals used on the trees, they didn't even spray the bees. They sprayed the flowers in the morning before bees started visiting, but then the flowers were toxic, and it killed all of these bumblebees, as well as honeybees, lady beetles, and more. And while the applicator, of course, didn't mean to kill all of these bees, it's a great example, I think, of recognizing that when we apply a pesticide, there can be these really large unintended consequences. And I also think that it's a stark reminder that it doesn't matter how high quality the habitat we create is in cities and towns if pollinators aren't protected from pesticide applications like this one. Not to keep talking about depressing things here, but I just wanted to share another case study that was much more recent, except this time with monarchs instead of bees. In January to February of 2024, 200 monarchs were found dead or dying with symptoms of pesticide poisoning at overwintering sites in Pacific Grove in California. And we were kind of contacted and we helped do some residue analysis, and we found really high levels of 3 different pyrethroid insecticides, which were a group of insecticides that are highly toxic to all sorts of insects. And as best we can figure, the most likely local uses were some sort of structural or landscape maintenance application, like a granular ant control that caused this die-off. So again, just trying to emphasize that these non-agricultural pesticide uses are largely untracked, and they do really pose risks to all sorts of pollinators and other beneficial insects. So I just want to dive into a quick review about pesticide use and some of the risks to pollinators and other insects. So pesticide is an umbrella term. And again, this is likely review for most of you, but I just wanted to kind of make sure we're all on the same page. Our focus has been mostly on insecticides, which kill insects, as well as herbicides, which kill plants, and fungicides, which kill fungi and other kind of mildews. And of course, many of the same chemicals that are also registered as insecticides are also registered as miticides or to control other non-insect invertebrates. And most of you are likely aware that many insecticides are highly toxic to pollinators and other insects. Some insecticides are more targeted than others in the groups of insects that they impact, but many tend to be very broad. They kill target pests, but also everything else. And modern insecticides are very potent, and newer ones, you may have heard of neonicotinoids, which I just mentioned on the other slide, that have been made to replace older chemicals, aren't more friendly to bees and are actually more concerning in many ways. I also want to note really quickly that one of the other downsides of pesticides is that they only treat the symptom, which is the pest outbreak, not the cause of the outbreak. Comparison that we use sometimes is that it's like taking Advil for a headache, when really you need to get new glasses or to stop staring at computer screens. So this might be a little bit in the weeds, but I did want to touch a little bit on pesticide oversight and why just following the label on a bottle of pesticides isn't enough to protect pollinators. And in fact, we want to do much more than just follow the label on pesticides. Because current federal regulation states that pesticides should have, and the quote is, no unreasonable adverse effects, but that's really open to interpretation. Federal pesticide regulation both accepts and expects there to be risks to wildlife. They just believe that the benefits provided by the pesticides outweigh the harm that they cause. So when we're trying to recover pollinator species or create havens for insects in urban spaces, that standard isn't enough, which is why we encourage people to go beyond just following what's on the label to find ways to truly protect these species. So there's a long list of ways that the EPA, which is the federal agency that oversees pesticides, that their assessments underestimate the risk to pollinators and other beneficial insects, which then leads to harmful pesticide uses. And I'll list a few of those concerns really quickly so we have a little grounding on this. So one issue is that the assessments generally focus on only one chemical at a time, but pesticides are rarely found alone in the environment, whether the sampling is of water, soil, or pollinator habitat. At Xerces with partners, we actually did a study looking at pesticides on milkweed plants up and down the Central Valley of California, and we found up to 25 pesticides on a single milkweed plant with an average of 9 pesticides per plant. And we almost never know how these pesticides are interacting together and then what that impact on pollinators is. These assessments also don't consider specific risks to native bees and butterflies, like contaminated soil for ground nesting bees isn't considered, even though independent research has shown harm, or what this exposure does to the immature stages of insects instead of adults. And in general, they're only tested on a handful of insects. Most insect species aren't screened against these different chemicals. Finally, another problem with the standard toxicity testing is that the EPA really heavily weighs one outcome in their decision making, which is death. But insects that are exposed to less than a dose that kills them can have these other negative responses, and we call these sublethal effects. And a sublethal effect is anything short of death. So this could be decreased growth, a behavioral change, a change in physiology, a change in the insect's learning ability. And all of these impacts might reduce an insect's ability to reproduce or gather food for its offspring. So while it might not kill the insect directly, these small effects can add up at the population level. So we're obviously concerned about insecticide use because of the immense direct and indirect impacts that they have on pollinators because they're designed to kill insects. But I also want to emphasize that we're also concerned about other pesticides as well. In particular, there are both fungicides and herbicides that have been shown to have negative impacts on pollinators and other insects. Fungicides are often classified as practically non-toxic, but some have been linked with these subtle yet harmful impacts. Again, fungicides are pesticides that kill mildews and other similar fungi that damage plants and are widely used in all sorts of landscapes, agricultural, urban landscapes, and are actually typically the most abundant type of pesticide found in bumblebee and honeybee hive material. And bees that are exposed to fungicide appear to be more vulnerable to certain pathogens, most likely due to the fungicide's disturbance of the gut microflora of the bees. And the use of certain fungicides has also been linked to decline in a few bumblebee species. There's also a few fungicides that can actually multiply the toxicity of certain insecticides to pollinators when they're exposed to both at the same time. So that kind of goes back to what we were discussing on the previous slide, looking at that kind of synergy. Herbicides, which kill plants, are also, extremely widespread in agricultural, residential areas. Of course, they're also used in natural areas for invasive plant management. And their main impact is simply the loss of flowering plants in the landscape. They kill, stunt, or delay flowering in the broadleaf plants that provide food and shelter for pollinators, across all sorts of landscapes. And while they're generally much lower in toxicity compared to other pesticides, when they contact a pollinator, there is increasing evidence that, similar to fungicides, exposure to some herbicides can make bees more vulnerable to other stressors. For example, there are some studies that suggest that glyphosate may impact bees' abilities to navigate and also, again, interfere with bees' gut microbiomes, which might make them more susceptible to disease. And many herbicides are also systemic and may end up in nectar in that kind of window of exposure after application, but before the plant dies. Okay, so when we want to protect pollinators from pesticides, it's really important to consider their life history. And that's, where they live, when they're active, their life cycles, because this all influences how they might be exposed to pesticides. I can't cover the complete life history of every insect and every type of pollinator, but I want to give you a sense of when and where pollinators might be active and a bit about how they interact with the world, because that's going to help us understand exposure, which we'll talk about in the next section in this talk. So there's lots of different animals that visit flowers, usually for their sugary nectar, and end up pollinating those plants. I have some examples of them on this slide. We have butterflies, we have moths, beetles, hummingbirds, and even some flies, in particular syrphid flies, like the one on that purple flower on the top center photo there. These all provide pollination. And you might notice I didn't have bees on that last slide. They're our most important pollinators, so they get their own slides. We have, again, amazing diversity of native bees in the US. There's more than 5,000 species estimated in North America, and close to 4,000 in the United States alone. And they range in size from big carpenter bees and big bumblebees to tiny bees that are about the size of a grain of rice. And some of them don't look like what you might picture when you think of a bee, like that metallic green sweat bee on the bottom center right. Yes. I think that's a really beautiful bee. But I think they're all beautiful. And bees are particularly good pollinators because they aren't just visiting to sip on some nectar or have a quick snack of pollen. They're actively collecting pollen to bring back to their nests to feed their young. And they have specialized body parts to help collect that pollen and move it about really efficiently. You can see the bee on the top left side has pollen packed all on her legs there, and then the leafcutter bee, which is right below her. It's kind of hard to tell, but leafcutter bees have specialized hairs on the underside of their abdomen, and that's where they pack the pollen and collect it to bring back to their nests. So a quick note on bee life history. Of those, about 4,000 bees in the United States, over 90% of them are solitary. And this means they have no colony and no hive. It's just one female who emerges, mates, builds a nest, lays eggs, and does all of the foraging and flower visiting to provide her offspring with pollen. So a lot of hard work. But then that means there's no workers or colony to kind of buffer her from pesticide exposure. If she gets exposed to a pesticide, that's kind of the end of her reproductive output, unfortunately. Bumblebees are our only native bees that are social, really. They have a queen and workers, and often build nests in places like old rodent holes. Here's a photo of a bumblebee nest. They're smaller than honeybee nests or hives. And as a quick review, honeybees are from Europe, not native, and you can kind of think of them more as managed livestock than wildlife. And another difference too of these bumblebees is that their colony just only lasts for a year. So the queen will emerge. She lays eggs, builds this, has workers, creates this colony, but then they all die off by the end of the summer or early fall, and only newly emerging queens then overwinter and then start building a new nest. So I also want to give a quick slide to Lepidoptera, or butterflies and moths, because they're a common pollinator that people love seeing around. And they are sensitive to pesticides because not only do the adults visit flowers for nectar, but their caterpillars eat leaves, which, if they're contaminated, can be a long-term source of pesticide exposure. They pupate on branches or in the soil or hidden under leaf litter. And their life history can be quite varied. The photo here is a mourning cloak butterfly, which actually overwinters as an adult under leaf litter or in some other sheltered spot. And because of that, it's one of the first butterflies that you'll see flying in the spring. So just kind of a note that there can be these varied life histories, and butterflies are using all sorts of different parts of the landscape. And again, I want to note that there's a whole other variety of other pollinators. I don't have time to go into all of these life histories, but just again, a reminder that there are all of these other invertebrates and vertebrates that are pollinators and often provide other great ecosystem services like natural pest control, and pesticide use can also affect them. Many wasps and beetles develop as larvae in the ground, like this Bembic sand wasp and this checkered beetle larva. Some of these other pollinators, like many wasps, beetles, and flies, are actually also predators at some developmental stage or for their whole life. Syrphid flies, for example, are voracious predators as larvae, and then they function as pollinators as adults when they're visiting flowers. And then beetles like lady beetles are predators both as larvae and also adults, but as adults, they'll also visit flowers to supplement their diets with pollen. And then, though this is kind of outside of the scope of this talk, I want to also remind you that we also do have vertebrates like birds and bats that can be pollinators, and pesticide use can impact them both directly, but also indirectly since they rely on invertebrates and insects as food. So this might seem very obvious, but pollinators are floral visitors. And this is what most people think of when they think of these species. Pollinators, by default, visit flowers, thereby pollinating them. Here are some of our less heralded non-bee pollinators on flowers. We have a syrphid fly, beetles, a couple different types of wasps. And most of these species are visiting to drink nectar, but others will snack on pollen. As I just mentioned, there's many species like different types of beetles that people think of as predatory, but they're actually omnivores. And while they do hunt for pests like aphids, they will also supplement their diets with things like pollen and nectar. So this slide is just kind of stating the obvious, pollinators visit flowers. But many pollinators also spend much of their lives in the soil, and the substrate is super important for them. For bees, over 70% of that 4,000 native bees species I mentioned earlier actually nest in the ground. So they create little nests where they lay their eggs and their larvae develop. Bumblebees tend to nest in the ground, and often in places like old rodent burrows. And then beyond bees, many wasp species also nest in the ground, like sand wasps, for example. And then we also have beetle species that develop as larvae in the soil. And as adults, species like certain ground beetles will actually overwinter in the soil as adults. As I mentioned on the butterfly and moth slide, they'll develop in or around the soil. So I hope this is just convincing you that soil is also incredibly important for many different pollinator species across many different groups. So kind of thinking ahead when we're thinking about exposure to pesticides, species that use soil like this are particularly susceptible to soil applications of pesticides. So vegetation is also used in various different ways by various pollinator species. So the other 30% of our native bee species nest in cavities, and many of those bees utilize plant stems, like the one on the left there. That's a serotinid bee or a small carpenter bee. It's nesting inside of a blueberry cane. And then other bees, like leafcutter bees, actually snip circular discs out of leaves or flower petals and bring them back to line the insides of their nests with. And this center left photo shows a leafcutter bee damage on a plant where they've kind of cut these discs out of the leaf margins. And then the center right photo is a leafcutter bee that's bringing one of those little discs of leaf back to her nest. And of course, plant leaves are essential to caterpillars, like the one on the far right here. Caterpillars feed on the foliage of their host plants before pupating and becoming adult butterflies. Some are generalists and can feed on a range of plant species, while others are more limited to certain, a certain genus or even certain species. So again, thinking ahead to pesticide exposure, you can think about how these species might be particularly susceptible to foliar sprays or systemic pesticides that are expressed throughout the plant. So most people think of pollinators as daytime flower visitors, but I do want to note that there are many pollinators that are active at night. So there's actually 4 main groups of nocturnal pollinators. Moths are by far the largest and most diverse group. They're found all over the world where there are flowering plants. The rest of these nocturnal pollinators tend to be more concentrated at lower latitudes or closer to the equator, but up here we do have moths, beetles, and bees. And then in the Southwest US, there are also bat pollinators at night. And it might surprise you, but there's actually quite a few bees that are active at twilight or at night around the world. Over 250 species, according to a recently published review on nocturnal pollination. And there are also some species of beetles that are night pollinators. So just wanted to mention this because I think it's interesting, but also it's an important thing to keep in mind, since one recommendation you hear often for pesticide applications is to simply apply pesticides at night. And this won't be protective to all of the nocturnal pollinators. And then also residues of many insecticides will be active for much longer than just a few hours and can still impact pollinators the following day and beyond, which we can talk about soon. And I do want to note that pollinators aren't neatly divided into diurnal or nocturnal. Some fall into the twilight zone. There's a lot of pollinators that are most active around dawn and dusk. The term for this is crepuscular. And these pollinators are often around in dawn or dusk. And not all moths are nocturnal, not all bees are diurnal. There's always exceptions in ecology. And this is a hawk moth or a hummingbird moth, which can be sometimes mistaken for an actual hummingbird, but they're active often at dawn or dusk, sometimes at night, but then you'll also see them in the day sometimes. So it just kind of shows how varied life histories can be. Okay, so now that we did a quick kind of blast on some, touching on some pollinator life histories, where they live when they're active, let's now talk a little bit about exposure pathways. So these two topics, again, are directly related because how a pollinator is exposed to pesticides is, of course, dependent on its life history. So for exposure to pesticides, there's a couple main exposure pathways that we talk about. The first is contact or dermal or topical exposure. So this is the insect getting exposed on the outside of its cuticle or its skin. The other exposure pathway is oral via the insect ingesting contaminated food or water. When we consider duration, we usually separate that into two categories as well. So an acute exposure is a short-term or a one-time exposure. And this might be a bee being sprayed directly by an application, for example. And then the other is chronic exposure or continuous or ongoing. So this could include an insect that's feeding on a plant with pesticide residue, like the monarch butterfly eating the milkweed in this photo. Okay, so let's talk about some of these main exposure pathways. These are some of the examples, and we'll dive into them more on the next slide. Okay, so first we have direct contact. So this is when pollinators come into contact during the pesticide application. And this is what first comes to mind many times when people think about pesticide exposure to a pollinator. For example, a bee visiting flowers and being directly sprayed by an application, or a caterpillar that's on a plant, when the application's happening. Thinking again about the different pollinator life histories we just talked about earlier, many different organisms are active at different times of day. So simply spraying in the evening or night isn't going to protect, those nocturnal or crepuscular pollinators that we were just talking about. So just things to keep in mind when we're thinking about direct exposure. So another common exposure pathway is more indirect via residues. So this is when an insect comes in contact with a pesticide residue, a while after an application. So some examples of these often result in those chronic exposures, those kind of long-term or ongoing exposures. So a caterpillar eating leaves with pesticide residue from an application, that was made a few days ago, it might not die right away, but if it continues feeding on that plant for several days, that cumulative or chronic exposure can cause harm, either death or things that can impact their reproduction or delayed development, things like that. Another consideration is that for species that are less mobile, like that caterpillar, for example, the exposure might be greater because they can't just fly away. They're luckily stuck on that treated plant. I do also want to note that contaminated food can include contaminated prey for those pollinators that are also predaceous. So contaminated nesting materials are a common exposure route, and systemic applications can be particularly a risky source of contamination for nesting materials. As we mentioned in the life histories, many of our native bees are cavity nesters, and we'll use those places like hollowed out stems, like a carpenter bee, or as I mentioned, those leafcutter bees that are snipping pieces of leaves off to line their nest with. And these contaminated nesting materials can be a source of chronic exposure, both for adults, but then also, of course, the juvenile insects that are, developing inside of those nests. And again, I just love this photo of the little bee sticking its head out, so I included it again. So contaminated nesting sites. Nesting sites can be contaminated by pesticide applications. Common ones are, granular applications designed to kill grubs, or weed and feed applications, or soil drenches. Even applications that aren't designed to be applied to the soil, but that can easily wash off applied areas, can then contaminate soil. Again, thinking back to our life history slides, about 70% of our native bees, and then many other invertebrates nest in the ground, ground beetles, butterflies, moths, things like that. So granular applications that are designed to kill grubs in the turf, for example, will also kill everything else that's living there. Systemic drenches will be very toxic in areas where they're applied. For example, one study found an 89% reduction in squash bee reproduction in areas where the squash plants were treated with a soil drench of a systemic insecticide, imidacloprid. So that kind of brings us to this next slide. So I've mentioned this term a few times, but systemic pesticides are part of a growing number of chemicals designed to be uptaken and then expressed throughout the entire plant. And this makes the whole plant toxic, from the leaves to the roots to the pollen and nectar. So I want to touch on the risks of systemic pesticides, in particular systemic insecticides to pollinators. As I mentioned, again, they're absorbed by the plant, expressed throughout the tissue. So the whole plant, including the pollen and nectar, is toxic, which makes them very risky to pollinators and other invertebrates. Systemically treated plants can be a source of either acute or chronic exposure, and are risky to pollinators feeding on them, whether it's bees collecting pollen, wasps sipping on nectar, or caterpillars feeding on leaves. And then kind of looping these all back together, plants treated with these systemic insecticides also pose risk to those using them as nesting resources. Again, whether it's leafcutter bees, or even if it's, dropped foliage and it's something that a bee or a butterfly or a moth is overwintering under. And some common examples of the systemic insecticides are neonicotinoids, diamides like chlorantraniliprole, and then also fipronil, which is commonly used in structural treatments around buildings to treat for structural pests like termites or carpenter ants. So here's a couple examples of systemic application methods. We have tree injections like the one pictured here. Tree injections or soil drenches designed to be uptaken by trees can be a long-term source of toxic exposure because chemicals like neonicotinoids can last for a long time in woody plants. Studies have found them persisting at levels that are concerning for months to years later. And the reason for this is the insides of trees are very stable, as an environment for pesticides. There's no sunlight, there's no rain, no oxygen that, normally would really cause all of these pesticides to degrade, or at least not in the same amount. So this can lead to much longer exposure potential. And again, I'm not saying to never treat a tree, it's just to think about whether or not, is this a pest that's going to require continuous treatment? How high value is this tree? Is it already kind of dying, and is it worth treating? Just thinking about that, because again, many times these chemicals that are used to treat these sick or dying trees are going to be toxic to all of the pollinators and other invertebrates visiting them. Systemics are used in many other contexts. You can go to Home Depot and buy soil drenches to treat pests on roses that are systemics. So I just wanted to kind of mention some of those systemic application methods because they can vary. So I think something else that's really important to remember is that toxicity can vary by life stage. So the immature stages of insects are often much more susceptible to pesticides than adults, and there's certain insecticides like insect growth regulators that are specifically designed to kill immature insects. And where they can be exposed to pesticides varies by life stage as well. As we've discussed already, larval butterflies or caterpillars feed on leaves, while the adult butterflies don't. And then even bees have different diets. Here's an alkali bee larva that's feeding on a pollen ball provided by its mother. And larval bees and other insects spend extended periods of time, developing in their nests, from egg to larva to pupa. So something like contaminated soil will likely have a disproportionately large impact on those stages. And then in this example, for example, any residues in this pollen ball will be a chronic source of exposure to this larva because that's the only thing it gets to eat. It can't just pick up and move to a different pollen ball or a different plant. So just kind of thinking about how toxicity can vary by life stage, I think, is really important. And then I just want to spend a quick slide talking about how exposure relates to risk. So pesticide risk is toxicity and exposure. So this is the basic equation used in assessing risk and determining how and whether to register and label pesticides for use even. On one side of this equation, we have toxicity, which is the capacity of the pesticide to cause harm. How toxic is it? In what way? And then that other piece of the equation is exposure, which is what we've been talking about. How much of that pesticide is the pollinator exposed to? Was it exposed on the outside of its body, or did it ingest the pesticide in pollen or nectar or in the leaves of its host plant? And then how long was that exposure? Again, was it one time acute, or was it something that the pollinator was continually exposed to in its food or in its nest materials, making it a chronic exposure? So this kind of boils down to the common saying, the dose makes the poison. A highly toxic pesticide that a pollinator is minimally exposed to might actually be less risky in certain cases than a less toxic pesticide that a pollinator is consistently exposed to. And then, of course, the most risky is a highly toxic pesticide with a high dose exposure. So this kind of helps us start to think about how we can reduce risk to pollinators. If you decide to use pesticides to solve a pest problem, it might mean choosing a different, less toxic pesticide to use in managing a specific pest, or it might mean figuring out ways to protect habitat from exposure to pesticides so that the habitat doesn't become contaminated. Okay, so that kind of dovetails into our final section. So let's talk really quickly about how this kind of relates to an integrated pest management framework and how we can meaningfully reduce pesticide risk to pollinators. I know some of you might be experts in this area, but for others it might be new information or simply helpful review. So I think it's worth spending a few slides on talking about, IPM and how this all kind of fits in. Okay, so I want to spend a slide saying, what is IPM? I want to share some definitions that we like a lot because IPM is one of those concepts that can have, kind of slightly different definitions depending on who's using it and defining it. So one definition that we like is a comprehensive approach to solving pest problems that focuses on the big picture. Instead of simply trying to eliminate a pest, IPM involves changing factors that favor pests while using safer, less toxic methods that are effective and environmentally sound. That's from the city of Pasadena. Then we have IPM emphasizes prevention first and seeks to eliminate the underlying causes of plant diseases, weeds, and insect problems, rather than relying on routine use of pesticides. That's a definition that we have. And then IPM is a pest management strategy that focuses on long-term prevention or suppression of pest problems with minimum impact on human health, the environment, and non-target organisms. And that's from Mary Louise Flint, part of the University of California IPM. So what we've talked about in this talk, considering exposure routes as ways to reduce risk, are a consideration of IPM, but a component that's only one part of a holistic pest management system. So where does this fit into the framework? And this could be its own talk, but we want to quickly zoom out and run through some IPM concepts so we can see where this fits in. And I want to emphasize that reducing exposure and toxicity to pollinators via pesticides is kind of down the line when we're thinking about IPM. This is, when and if pesticides are used. but there's lots of non-chemical considerations that should be considered first. And I know this audience, has kind of a breadth of different backgrounds, from practitioners to potentially home gardeners. In the home garden, you might not use these exact phrases. And in fact, I don't usually talk about IPM when I talk to an audience of home gardeners. But the underlying concepts can be applied anywhere from, a home garden to a city or campus property. So we like to think of IPM as a three-legged stool. So the first leg is prevention. Prevention is all about addressing the root causes of pest issues with non-chemical approaches. So preventative practices keep the system healthier by eliminating conditions that favor pests, like ensuring plants are properly watered, ensuring soil pH and nutrient levels are correct, using different plant species, things like this. Ultimately, you're trying to reduce the stressors that can cause pest populations to increase out of control. And this leg is all about the use of non-chemical strategies. So things like mechanical or physical disruption of the pest, like hand weeding, also kind of fit in here. The second principle is about understanding what pests are in your landscape and if pest pressure even warrants any type of intervention. This means observing and tracking pest pressure regularly. Observing also helps you see if these non-chemical prevention methods are working and if you can continue to manage the pest with these kind of more low-impact methods. So thinking about pest pressure in your IPM plan is key for reducing reliance on pesticides. It's useful to constantly evaluate and make choices about when and where a pest is enough of a problem to justify the use of a pesticide. Often IPM practitioners will set thresholds for pests below which action doesn't need to be taken. And then finally, in some cases, there may be pests that defy these preventative management practices and kind of get above those tolerable levels. And while we certainly don't encourage the use of pesticides, if someone is going to apply a pesticide, it's important that they understand how to limit harm by reducing the risk of exposure, like we've been talking about, and by using pesticides of lower toxicity. So IPM is kind of built on these three principles. So like this three-legged stool in the image, together these can kind of balance a framework that can reduce reliance on pesticides and also reduce impacts to pollinators as well as people. And I want to stress that we're not just talking about substituting good chemicals for bad chemicals. Sometimes people think that substituting a newer product that's hyped as being greener is what IPM is all about. And that's not the approach we recommend, at least not exclusively. It's kind of part of this broader picture. So I'll quickly zoom in and kind of talk about each of these three legs of the stool in a little bit more detail. So prevention is basically the skilled use of horticultural maintenance strategies to keep the landscape healthy and in good condition. Or if indoors, maintenance to keep buildings less susceptible to pests. And it can include a host of general pest management practices, many of which many of you are already doing. For example, simply the principle of choosing the right plant for the right place, choosing a native adapted low maintenance plant as a primary prevention tool. Taking care of the soil, for example, using compost, slow release fertilizer if used, avoiding soil compaction, erosion, disturbance, things like that. Other basic measures shown on this list are also important. Sanitation is an important prevention strategy. In a landscape context, it's just making sure you dispose of weeds, seed heads, and other propagules like diseased tissue in a way that won't lead to further continued invasion and spread. Mowing high is often recommended as a practice for healthy turf that minimizes weed pressure. These are all general ideas. Obviously, specific recommendation and contexts are, our context and pest specific, but these are just kind of examples of good, non-chemical strategies. And then when it comes to invasive and emerging pests, we recommend consulting local experts for specific prevention practices. So moving on to that second leg of the stool, monitoring. Monitoring is about knowing which pests are in your system, what habitats they're occupying, tracking the level of pressure, and determining whether that pressure is at a point that might trigger intervention, such as pesticide use. So this step requires that staff or people in the field can identify weeds and insects, diseases, understand their life cycles or habitat needs, or can pull in people or resources who can. Monitoring can include a lot of items. It's sometimes about doing inspections to note the presence and abundance of the pests themselves. I have a couple examples shown here, including in this photo, somebody's dragging for ticks in a grassy area, or using sticky bands on a tree trunk to detect for invasive insects, or simply just turning a leaf over to look for the presence of pests like whiteflies or aphids underneath. But monitoring is also about looking for pest-conducive conditions. So this would include things like testing soil chemistry, biology on a sports field, or looking for standing water where mosquitoes can breed around buildings. And doing this step well, although it might seem like a lot of work, is really important to reducing pesticide reliance. Monitoring can actually save on cost and prevent unnecessary ecological damage by reducing those pesticide inputs to the system. And then, keeping records obviously can help keep you systematic and track trends over time. And I do want to note that not every sign of damage on a plant is a sign of something concerning. Healthy plants can take a good amount of feeding damage. And in fact, there's research that suggests a bit of feeding damage can help kind of rev up the plant's natural defenses. It also means that these plants are being used as a resource by insects and other wildlife, which ultimately is, a great thing. So now that last principle of the stool is kind of where our earlier talk fits in, limiting pesticide harm. So I do want to be clear that the overall best way to limit pesticide harm is to switch away from pesticides towards non-chemical methods wherever you can. So looping back to the exposure part of our talk, you can reduce harm by reducing toxicity and exposure. So when and where you think you will be using pesticides, build in ways to choose substances that are less toxic and apply them in a way that reduces exposure to bees, other invertebrates, aquatic life, things like that. So some tips that we recommend include no spray zones. Many cities or HOAs even have pesticide-free parks or areas or specific pollinator habitats where pesticide use isn't allowed. Obviously having a warning system, signage can be helpful, and advance notification for people, including automated telephone calls or texts to people who sign up for alerts. But of course, pollinators can't be alerted in advance. So there's lots of recommendations for ways to avoid impacting pollinators, like not applying to flowering plants, avoiding soil applications where nesting may be occurring, avoiding systemic pesticides. But as we mentioned through our exposure slides, this might reduce the risk, but not eliminate it, and not for all of the different insects that are present at a site, which is why we advocate for non-chemical solutions as much as possible. We'd of course recommend stopping routine use of hidden pesticide uses, such as combination fertilizer herbicide products, and then choosing lower toxicity products if pesticides are being used. That's an example of 2 additional ways to kind of limit that potential for harm. So wherever possible, using lower toxicity products. Examples might include insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils. And using targeted treatments. If you can, find a product that's targeted towards the pest. Try not to use these broad spectrum pesticides that are highly toxic, and use the product at the lowest effective dose in as small of an area as possible. So as I wrap up here, I do want to encourage you all to think of our urban green spaces, yards, parks as habitat that can provide resources for the insects that can and will thrive there. An herbivore is not necessarily a pest. As I mentioned, only about 2% of insects are considered pests, and the other 98% are actively beneficial to you or the ecosystem. And this involves accepting some level of cosmetic damage in your home gardens and parks. I think that this ultimately means that your yard is being used by a broad community of insects, birds, and other animals. I know there's a diversity of people attending this talk, and maybe you work in home yards for a municipality, you might be a home gardener, and I appreciate that all of you may have various pressures when it comes to plant appearance, but trying to shift our perspective on what our green spaces, our parks and yards are, and what they can be, resources for these amazing creatures, is a really great first step. And yeah, municipal parks, campus properties are really important. But for those of you who work in residential spaces or are home gardeners, you might wonder sometimes how to get your neighbor to reduce their pesticide impact. I think residential pesticide use is a really important thing to think about because it does account for a big footprint in the US, and making progress here is important. And as I mentioned, a lot of the same IPM principles can be used in the home yard. At home, gardeners can employ non-chemical strategies and techniques that work well in small spaces. And I think another important thing is to engage more people in using these resources. Is a key to kind of inspiring, educating, organizing. Many residents aren't aware of the impact that pesticides and typical gardening practices can have on pollinators and other invertebrates. So doing this type of outreach, talking to your neighbor is really important. So I do want to end by mentioning that a great reason to be focused on these kind of ecologically based pest management practices is that urban areas, including our urban parks and residential areas, hold a really high potential for bee and other pollinator conservation. Studies have found some cities to have really surprisingly diverse and relatively intact pollinator communities, and cities can even have a higher bee diversity than the surrounding landscapes. So residential areas really can function as high quality habitat and refuges for insects and other animals like birds, even at the single site level, like a yard or a park. But together, numerous sites can kind of scale up and provide this connected and functional habitat across the landscape. But these areas need to be managed properly, including protection from pesticides for them to kind of reach their true conservation benefit. So I want to quickly note that we have a variety of resources related to this topic that might be useful. Here's a few that are particularly relevant. And we have other resources for community pesticide reduction. So I encourage you to all go to the Xerces site, and you can go. You can also feel free to email me if you have specific questions or are interested in certain resources, and I can try to kind of connect you with the resources we have. And yeah, I have my email as well as the pesticides@xerces.org email. And with that, I think we probably have a little bit of time for questions.
Awesome. That was great, Aaron. Thank you. I'm especially interested in that piece about that urban areas can have greater bee diversity than rural areas. That's unexpected for me.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. That was a fantastic presentation. Probably one of the best IPM talks I've heard in a long time. We started with a great talk about emerald ash borer, and you're just keeping up the quality. I've got a couple technical questions for you. One is about people arborist chips that we use oftentimes to suppress weeds. Do you have any opinions on, is there a timing for the best time to apply arborist chips so that we're not disturbing the life cycle of ground bees?
That's a really good question. And unfortunately, I don't have an answer to that that's, kind of a sure proof, like, oh, this is the way to do it. Because unfortunately, it's, they're present all year round, right? So bee will emerge. And I think something that's important to note is that different bee species do emerge at different times of the year, which is why one of our general habitat recommendations is to make sure you have flowering plants in your parks or gardens, your urban habitat all season long, because some might be emerging in May, but others won't be emerging until July. So for these ground nesting bees, we'll have a bee will emerge. She'll mate. She'll start foraging, build a new nest, lay eggs, and then that egg, larva, pupa will develop over the course of the year and then emerge. So if at any point that's kind of covered, it's going to potentially be an issue. So the recommendation I would have is that just try to leave some area in your yard or property, wherever you're managing, that does have bare soil. And I think that's the best way to kind of, because I do the same, in my yard, I'm mulching lots of things with arborist chips. But I think one of the issues is a lot of times in urban areas, we have everything is either planted or mulched, right? We just don't have a lot of bare soil. So I think the solution is if you can try to just keep some patches that are bare, you'll provide that nesting resource for some of those ground nesting bees, because it's a great comment that, if we're completely mulching everything, the access to that soil for nesting won't be there.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's great information. Is something, it was a great question because it's something I've been
Yeah.
thinking about too. Also when like cleaning a garden out, not like cutting it all the way to the ground and taking away all the vegetable matter because that's potential habitat. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, we one of the things we definitely recommend is, you might have heard the phrase "leave the leaves," in your yard to provide that kind of overwintering habitat. But we also like to say save the stems. Like, if you kind of cut stems back to various heights, and you want to leave those up for, it's almost like 2 full years, because the stems you cut back the first year aren't going to be used as a nesting resource that year. Those dead stems will then be used the next year, and then
Mm.
you want to leave those up for another season for the bees to actually emerge. So, yeah, so you have to kind of leave your stems for a while. But luckily, if you can cut them back pretty low, and they don't have to be, too much of an eyesore to the neighborhood.
Well,
But
that's good to know,
yeah,
that it's a 2-year thing. The
yeah.
next question is about chafer beetles, which attack lawns, and they're wondering, BT is one of the common treatments. Would it be better to just avoid BT for the sake of, you know, these pollinating insects, or should we use nematodes instead? Or what's your opinion on that?
That's a great question, and the person who asked the question can feel free to follow up with me. They can email me. The chafer beetles and other kind of grub insects, I think it's one of those ones where the kind of cultural care solution can be a little bit context dependent, depending on, what the pest is, what your landscape type is, what the climate is, because there are some grubs that you can kind of control using some cultural care things. In general, BT is, a much less riskier solution than some of, those broad spectrum insecticides and things like that. But I think, it is important to remember, if you are using a product that will kill something like, a grub, a beetle, that's a pest, it will also kill the non-target beetles in your yard as well. So it is less risky, but like a lot of the um, kind of less toxic solutions, it doesn't mean that it's free of risk. So that's, yeah, so not a super satisfying answer, but yeah, a less risky application type. But yeah, it's hard to know a specific recommendation without kind of, yeah, knowing the specific context.
Okay, next question is about ground nesting wasps, in particular things like yellow jackets. Like, how do
Yeah.
we, since they actually pose a danger to the public, how can we move the nests, or what's your strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll note that there's a lot of ground nesting wasps that really don't bother you at all. They're solitary, like those Bembex sand wasps. Do great things, great pest control. They're not going to sting you. But yes, for things like yellow jackets, that's obviously a concern. Especially in areas near people's patios or in a park. So the number one thing that we recommend first is sanitation, right? So making sure that they're attracted to the sugary drinks that we have, on our patio or in a park, because adult yellow jackets actually sip on nectar from flowers, or their larvae actually produce a sugary substance that then the adult yellow jackets feed on. So later in the year, as more of their yellow jacket, either their young are developing and turning into adults, there's less of that sugary substance being emitted within the nest. So then they start looking other places for sugar. So making sure that you're not leaving drinks out, making sure that the lids on trash cans are tight is a really important thing to do to kind of minimize that potential conflict. But then we definitely recommend, during the fall, if you have rodent burrows on your property, trying to collapse those, because often yellow jackets will nest in old rodent holes. So eliminating those potential nesting locations is a strategy that you can use. You can use traps, earlier in the spring to try to trap queens. That's a strategy that people use to then avoid, those colonies from actually kind of developing on your property. If you really have a high conflict area where you have a nest right near someplace where people often are, we recommend if you are going to have the nest removed, contacting a professional, because going in and spraying it yourself both is potentially more risky to yourself being stung, but then also, the higher potential for misapplication of pesticides. But there are different strategies you can use to avoid getting to that point, I think. And if that person has a question, please feel free to email me, and I can send you some of our Yellow Jacket control resources.
Okay, excellent. Here's a somewhat follow-up question. How many plants can you have and yet still have an area considered bare soil? And does fallen leaf matter and debris count?
Oh, that's a great question. So yeah, basically, you can have, like, bees will crawl around on the ground, go underneath plants, as long as, I think, there's bare soil that's present and accessible, you can see it. I think that's fine. I think that if you're having, really kind of low growing ground covers, that would count as something that, a bee wouldn't be able to really access. But if you just have a plant and there's bare soil underneath, that's fine. I think light leaf litter is fine. But if it's becoming like a really heavy layer of leaf litter and mulch, that's an example where you might want to clear that away to kind of leave that bare soil for the bees to nest in. Yeah, so I don't have a hard number of how many plants you can have in an area and still be considered bare soil, but I think, again, if you can see patches of soil, I think that's what my recommendation would be.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Erin, and also Steve, for facilitating the question and answer session. That was super informative, wonderful IPM discussion. We're going to take another quick break. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Sky, I can still see your shared screen, so you don't have to reshare. So you look perfect on my end. Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are now going to hear from Sky Policia of the King County Noxious Weeds program to discuss using smartphone apps for weed identification and reporting. Sky has been working in the environmental restoration field here in Seattle for 6 years. And as someone without a formal educational background in botany, she's especially passionate about making the field more accessible to all. I love that, Sky. Outside of the Noxious Weeds program, she's active in several groups that focus on the intersectionality between environmental ecology and equity and social justice. Thank you so much, Sky.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on today. I'm glad that we got the speakers working out, and I'm just looking at the chat, seeing what people have. All right, we have a lot of iPhones. Okay, we have one flip phone. I will say, my flip phone friend, this might not apply to you as well, but we do have parts that I will be talking about, web browsers. Okay, we have some Androids coming in here, both. Okay, this is honestly a fair mix. There tends to be this like big iPhone dominance. You know how that goes, but all right. Well, sweet. Thank you for the data. And with that, yeah, today I'm going to talk about how we can use phones as a tool for plant ID and tracking, notably using iNaturalist. So what's helpful is if you have a plant photo, which if you're in this talk, you might have a plant photo on your phone somewhere, preferably of a plant outside that would be good for ID purposes. If not, I will have a slide that you can take a picture of a plant just so you can use it for the demos today. So what I'm going to cover is just going to be a few things. Start by talking about using phones for plant ID, some built-in tools, as well as some external apps. And then we're going to have a good focus on iNaturalist, which I do want to note that with King County Noxious Weeds, we are not related to iNaturalist at all. We don't have necessarily a contract or anything of that sort. We just think it's a really valuable tool. It's free, and we want people to know that it is accessible for most people to use. And then lastly, we'll be talking about how our team for the past year has been integrating our iNaturalist data into GIS that we use for our workflow. Come on. All right, guess we're using the mouse today. All right, so I'm going to have some demos. You don't necessarily have to follow along, especially if you are on a phone. It might be annoying to follow along. So instead, I'd just like watch closely or listen well. But otherwise, if you are at a computer, this will be a good opportunity to have your smartphone on you with that plant pick. Okay, so first of all, you might be familiar with some of these apps I'm going to talk about, some built in as well as some that you can download, including I'm seeing PlantNet. PlantNet is also great. I won't be focusing on that today, but I have in previous talks. But in general, how all of these work, they all have different formulas and different databases. But the gist is that artificial intelligence, using algorithms, using deep learning, they essentially take your photo, they scan it, and they look at these layers, and then they try to compare whatever layers and features they're seeing to those in their database that already have confirmed ID. And the more comparable features that are there, the more confidence that it has. And that's essentially how it works. So some of them, it's based on like this huge database. Some of them, it's based on a local database. So the efficacy is going to depend on where you are as well as the photo itself. But regardless, just before I have this whole talk, just remembering that at the end of the day, it's not foolproof, and you always want to verify this ID before taking action through other means, whether that's fellow plant people, maybe a dichotomous key, other online resources. But what makes a good photo? When I first gave a talk similar to this, I didn't have this slide, but then people would send me a fuzzy picture of grass and say, why didn't it work? So I want to clarify what makes a good photo, because recognizing at the end of the day, this is a computer brain. You want something that's clear, not blurry, preferably does not have a busy background, has an obvious focal point, shows more individual plant detail, and the more features that you have, that being, like not just leaves, but also flowers, the better it will do. So in the chat, if you could send either number 1 or number 2 of which photo you think will make for a better plant ID photo. And then just also thinking to yourself, why? One. Surprise, it's 2. Just kidding. It is 1. So yes, it seems like most of you caught on that it's number 1, but in terms of the reasoning, yes, this photo in the bottom center is clear in terms of the leaves if you're looking at it, but recognizing that it's just going to be scanned by a computer, it's just going to see this wall of green, and it's kind of hard to distinguish where the plant starts and stops if you're looking at it just based on color. And while this top one is great, and if you are doing plant ID in a place that has a lot of already ID'd plants or like has a big local database, number 1 might be enough, but what would make it better is if you had more features. So while the leaves alone, a lot of plants in this genus are going to have similar leaves, what's going to distinguish it is going to be usually its flowers. But you can also look at growth habit, like where it's growing, how it's growing, leaf detail, stem, and that will make it better. So just to look at a couple more photos of some pros and cons. So this one, it does have the flowers, and sometimes it still will ID it fine with this. It is also pretty busy, and again, imagining this image scanning, it might scan this as a giant shrub, which these photos are all of tansy ragwort. If you know it, it's not a giant shrub, it's a standalone biennial plant, and it might look for, okay, where are other shrubs with yellow flowers? This one, while it is a focused image in the center, if you know your plants decently well, you might recognize that in the foreground, we also have some common tansy. It's going to include those. Even though your eyes are focusing on that center photo, you want to realize what else is in the photo as well. And then this one is an example of a pretty solid one. It's a high contrast background, very focused. And the funny thing is, when I was practicing and I ran this one through, if you look closely, there's a cinnabar moth on the left top part of that flower cluster. And iNaturalist actually tried to identify both the cinnabar moth and the tansy. So just being mindful of what you have in there. And with that said, we will let the demos begin. So if you do not have a plant photo pulled up on your phone, but you want to do the demos, this is your chance to just take a picture of this picture. I promise it usually works. Sometimes people will send us the craziest plant ID photos. And if I don't feel like using a dichotomous key, I will take a picture on my computer. So it should work. And 3, 2, 1. If you miss the window, find one on your phone, or you can also just Google a photo and screenshot it. Totally works. So First one I'm going to look at, this is from iPhone users. So hop out that iPhone. Again, these first tools are built in and you very well might be aware of them, but I was surprised by how many people aren't, because it was never really well advertised in my opinion. So you're just going to bring up your normal photo gallery to get started. And some perks of this one, you can identify random things. It's not limited to living things. I've used it to identify pets and landmarks and other things. Uses what's called Siri knowledge, but some downfalls comparatively to other ones I'll mention is that it does not inventory or save these searches. And then there's no option for ID support. So if you're using this tool, you can't figure out what species it is. That's kind of where you're landing if you're not going to use something else. So once you are in your iPhone Photos app, you're going to open that plant photo. And once you're there, you have two options of what to do next. You can either swipe up on your screen or you can press the icon. Depending on your update, it's going to be one of these two bars most likely. But that's either going to be an eye, or sometimes if it's a plant, it'll already have a leaf in it. Regardless, it'll be a circular icon. You're going to click on that or swipe up. And then what's going to show up is this look up blank. Sometimes if it's not certain, it'll say look up plant, or it'll say look up, it'll be like conium genus. But in this case, it says look up poison hemlock. No matter what, you're going to click on that. And now Siri Knowledge will show you some suspected species and related information. So what I find useful here also is that if you want to do show more, what it's showing here are the species in order of confidence. So there's going to be other species in that show more list, because if you see them and you're like, this isn't it, go ahead and look through that. But what I found to be even more helpful, especially for ornamentals or houseplants, is if you scroll down, going through these similar web images, you are going to creep through those photos and you can find one that looks most like the one that you're looking at right there. You can click on it and you can actually go to the source link of the photo, learn more, and confirm for yourself what it is. And while you can't inventory in this setting, you can either screenshot it or just know that any time that you have internet service, that this is going to be an option. And that's how you use the iPhones app. And using these first two while you can't inventory, this is always a good and easy first step before you put it into any of the inventory apps. Okay, so for my Android users, and admittedly for iPhone users, you can access this as well. Just for Androids, especially Google specific phones, these are going to be built in. Google has a feature called Google Lens, and it's going to be built into its search, into its photos, into its lens, and into any place that you can access a Google search bar. On Androids, there's often an option that you have a widget, just a part of your phone screen somewhere, that you can have a Google bar, so it might be there as well. iPhone users, if you don't have any of these apps, you can also just go to google.com for the sake of this exercise. So some perks of the Google apps is that you can identify random things with this one as well. And it's pretty effective. I've used it on some crazy things. I've used it to figure out where a sweater someone had was from, different landmarks, just a number of things. And in this one, you can opt to save the history as an inventory, but you won't be able to isolate plants. So if you use it for other things, that will just be one thing of note. And then again, there's not going to be a collaboration or ID support option here, but still a great first step. So as I said, it's going to be built in for most Androids or google.com otherwise. The first option I'm going to mention is Google Photos. This is often the default Photos app on Androids or Googles. Just look for that red, yellow, blue, green symbol. If it's not your photo gallery, you could still check it out. I've tried this on a number of people's Androids and it's always in different places, but the main theme here is going to be this camera button. So in Google Photos, when you do it, it's going to be on the bar and it's going to say lens or have the camera icon. On other Androids, I've also seen that even in their photo gallery, it's a similar thing. You just look for a camera button when you're looking at your images. And in the Google Lens option, it's going to bring up your photo. You can crop to the extent you want. And then like in the iPhone, it's going to show you its species based on order of confidence. And you can scroll through those, go to those web pages, see more photos that are related, and learn more. The other option will be, again, via that Google search bar, which could either be google.com in the Google search app, or in this case on an Android home screen. This is what a widget is. It's just something that is placed on your phone. It's usually a setting that you've set up, but sometimes it's the default. And again, on any of these search bars, you're just going to be looking for that camera icon. And when you click on it, it's going to take you to your photo gallery. You select your photo, and then that's it. It brings you back to the same page. You can look through. And again, you can set up right when you start using this of whether or not you want it to inventory. But at the end of the day, my favorite inventory options are still going to be in iNaturalist. So in the chat, just out of curiosity, could y'all tell me if you have used iNaturalist and if it has been for work or for personal life, and anything else you think would be helpful to know, like how you've used it? Got a mixed bag. Cool. Yeah, to report invasives in my neighborhood. How cool. On vacation. ID. No. All right, sweet. It's a good mix, but honestly, there's a lot of people who are familiar, and that is helpful to get going on this. And even if you're not, I'm going to explain it anyways. So, iNaturalist, if you're unfamiliar, it is a citizen science or crowdsourced science platform. And what it's used for, it is for identifying and automatically inventorying all living things. So this can be used on any phone. The main thing is that these are going to be apps. Particularly, oh, my keyboard is not working. There's going to be 2 app options. And this is also how you can report King County weeds in King County. It's going to be by posting observations, which we will talk plenty about. But yeah, it doesn't just work for plants. While I use it for plants as a big plant person, it works for birds. It works for bugs. I've used it on anemones. It's really cool. There's 2 apps. You can identify and inventory living things. And the idea is that our observations as people creates this big database that other people, including ourselves, can use it as a form of citizen science or crowdsourced community science. And it helps inform a lot of things. It's been used at grants. And if you want to find a way to contribute to naturalist things, this is a pretty solid place to start. But if you've noticed there's 2 apps and you're not sure what the difference is, so for one, the Seek by iNaturalist app, it's simpler. In my opinion, it has better ID. And that's because on Seek, this is the one that you can use your phone camera live to ID a plant. So for a lot of things, you will upload photos. Using the Seek, you can use your camera and just move your way around a plant when you're in the field. You can also use it offline. You can't save your observations when you use it offline, but I have used it in a pinch, just being able to ID things in the field. But again, it's better for ID. It's pretty simple. You don't have to have a login. So I will recommend connecting to iNaturalist, and you'll hear why soon. But this is a pretty good place to start. Whereas iNaturalist was seen as the parent app, in quotes, and you can also access the same platform from inaturalist.org. This one is going to be better. Maybe if you at least have an idea of the ID, or even if you're just trying to figure it out in the first place. But it's really a great place for contributing to and exploring community science while still having the basics of being able to post an observation, inventory it, have some ID support. I've just had not as much luck using iNaturalist itself for ID, but that's the cool thing, is that this is owned by the same group, and you can use the same login for both. So Seek, best for beginner to intermediate, especially if your goal is IDing, and then you can optionally end up integrating it to iNaturalist, which is for more intermediate to expert. You can totally use iNaturalist as a beginner. I just think it's a pretty janky platform. I'm not a huge fan of the platform by itself, but I do love it for its purpose, so I'm willing to push through. But it's not as motivating to me. But here the goal is more to affirm ID, and then for that, in quotes, citizen science. But my big hot tip of everything I'm going to talk about, if you're not sure which one to go with, you can start with the Seek app. Just make sure that you create an iNaturalist account and then log into it on your Seek. That will give you the opportunity to use the perks of the ID effectiveness of Seek while being able to press Post to iNaturalist, which allows you to contribute to citizen science. And then you can have that account and choose to get into exploring when you want to. And you can just look up either of those names, Seek or iNaturalist, in the App Store. And I have the logo for each of them on the pages where I'll be talking about it. So in this one, Seek by iNaturalist, it has that leaf logo. This is the one with the live camera. In this example, I'm going to show what it'll look like using the live camera, but I also want to recognize that you're probably not able to actually use this feature as we speak. You'll be using the camera one. So here, once you're logged in the bottom center, there's going to be a camera button. And then when you open it up, you'll be able to either choose live photo like camera or photos. If you're following along, you'll probably end up doing photos, but the camera option I really like because here at the top, this is something that I didn't notice when I first started using it. There's going to be these dots, and the dots mean something. So right now with this photo or with like this live, I had gotten 2 species, but that is indicated secretly by these green dots at the top here. So sometimes it'll only get to genus or family, and then those dots won't show up. So you try to kind of move your camera around until it gets to species. There's a setting that it can automatically capture it, or you can have it so that you have to click it. Because the only thing, if you do the automatic capture and you're actually planning to post to iNaturalist, sometimes it'll give you some blurry photos, but totally up to you. And when you're ready, if you don't have that automatic capture, you'll just press the camera. And now you've either seen a new species or recited a species. From here, you have 2 options, typically, especially if you're logged in already to iNaturalist. For one, you can view the species, and I think it's really helpful because right off the bat, it's going to tell you based on your location if it's introduced or not. So for folks who are getting new into the field, fun fact, Seek by iNaturalist is how I learned my plants when I moved out here with a geology degree. And that introduced versus native is a really helpful feature. You can also look at its Wikipedia page, all that good stuff. But the other option back on this screen will be that you can post to iNaturalist. This is going to be that in-between option I was talking about, that you can use the usefulness of this ID app while still being able to contribute to citizen science. Again, if you're doing this one, it is good if you can have a decent photo. You can always add more photos too. But when you go to post to iNaturalist, you will be able to edit information as appropriate. Some main ones I will look at. Location is one thing. You can double check that. But as long as if you did it live and you're still there, pardon me, still should be good. Oh, goodness. Okay, and the geo-privacy, that's an important one. If you are on a private property that you don't want other people to creep onto, I do recommend putting obscured. Goodness, I do recommend putting obscured because open means anybody can see the exact location, and that works well for public properties or like if you're out in the field. But if you are at your house, your friend's house, and you don't want some passionate plant people to creep up onto that property, consider putting it as obscured because it'll just keep it to a general location like North Seattle or something like that. And then captive or cultivated, you'll just edit that. If you're, for instance, in a garden, that will be yes, but otherwise it's going to be no. And then you post it, and that is all. And this is a really quick process. Okay, now Seek by iNaturalist for inventorying. This is the other half of Seek that differentiates it from the Google or the iPhone apps. That's going to be similar for just the normal iNaturalist. But to access your inventory, you're going to press these 3 bars on the left side, and then you will just click on My Observations. I will say I'm not going to go into it because I'm not an iNaturalist rep, but there's a lot of options here. You can track achievements if you like to gamify things. There's different challenges you can join. This is where you'll get into your own iNaturalist. Learn more, but I tend to mostly use Seek for my observations. So you'll click on that, and then your observations will show in chronological order. You can also search it by name, but this is helpful, especially if you have landowners or something that you work with and they just want to go and learn the plants on their property. They can always go back to this list and reference it in the future. And I think that's pretty helpful, especially if you're getting into it or just want something more basic. Okay, now I will talk about iNaturalist. So iNaturalist itself, again, any of your Seek observations will actually show up here, but you can also make observations here specifically. This is going to be one that if you want to use several photos versus just one, you'll go here, or especially if you're more comfortable with what you think it is, or if you just know what the family is and you for sure want to post on iNaturalist, this is a good place to start. I will say, iNaturalist is supposed to have a makeover soon. I don't love this interface. It looks pretty similar if you just go to iNaturalist.org. So if you do want to follow along and you have an account, you can do this on iNaturalist.org. You'll just have to press observe in a different location. This is what the app looks like. So first thing to notice that differentiates it from other platforms is that while you're able to post from Seek, here you can actually interact and like see what people are saying about your observations. So these little comments here, the red ones are ones I haven't opened, the black ones I have. And these are just people either confirming my ID, it's potentially, for instance, the aggregating anemone. I think I just had anemones and then a marine bio person came in and said what species it was. Here's where you can have those interactions, which I think are pretty cool. But in terms of making an observation, you're going to press the camera. And then I tend to go with photo library because the camera is not like the one on Seek. On Seek, it's technically a live video that it is taking in that data. On this one, the camera is just the camera and it is just going to take a single photo. So if you're like me and you want to kind of get the photo that you want, take photos first, click on photo library, and then you will go here. You can see I only put one in this example when I made it a bit back. But you can add up to 5 photos here, which will also help with the app's ability to identify the plant. You can press what did you see, and then it will show you these suggestions. That's what you have to do no matter what, because it'll show you suggestions, or you can look up the species. Here, the same photo that worked in both Seek, iPhone, and Google did not work for me all the way in iNaturalist, which is why I have mild beef with it. But it works sometimes, especially because you can do more photos. In this case, if I wasn't sure, I would just press the genus Conium, and then other people could comment and put their thoughts on the ID. But because I knew what it was, I ended up just typing in the species by name. Whenever you'll do it, no matter what, you'll click on that species, and that will be considering accepting the suggestion, and that will show up on your report. And then again, this is going to be the same stats essentially as Seek. The only difference you'll see here is projects, which we'll talk about for a bit here soon. But in general, making sure the location is correct and that the geo-privacy is set to either private, obscured, open, based on your purposes or where you are. But in general, it's really helpful to have it on open unless it is a protected location, which is completely understood. That could be maybe on private lands, tribal lands, rare species. Just think critically, trust yourself, and then you'll press share. Okay, so now we're going to talk about iNaturalist projects, which these are really cool. This is like level up iNaturalist, even if you've used it before. I do recommend looking into different projects and exploring it, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is how we're using it in King County Noxious Weeds, and as well as ways that you could implement it yourself in your work or in your personal life. But in general, just note that this is a free tool. It's for land managers, citizen scientists, really whoever's interested. All you need is an iNaturalist account. So just to clarify 2 of the main words I'll be using, when I say observation, that's going to be any of these recorded interactions with the species in this iNaturalist platform that I've submitted. So that's either from Seek I've posted to iNaturalist, or in iNaturalist I've posted it as an observation, either in the app, in my browser on my phone, on the computer, anything of that sort. And typically it's going to include the species or just something about whatever it is, the location, photos, etc. And then we have an iNaturalist project. There's a few types that I will talk about, but in general, they're just these intentional collections of observations from the iNaturalist database, which what is in the iNaturalist database? Well, yesterday I checked and there's 228 plus million observations that are available to anybody who is making a project. It's not to say you're going to have all of these in your project, because these are worldwide, all species of all these living things. But the point is that especially for newer or smaller groups or just personal interests, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to do all of this work by yourself of tracking these species and finding them. This is a pretty common platform, and depending on where you are, this can be a really effective way to create a free tracking tool for whatever you're trying to do. So again, all this data, it is meant for us to use, and there's a lot available. So keeping in mind what an iNaturalist project is, an intentional collection, and what makes a collection intentional, it just means that you're setting these parameters to what you want to inventory. So just some examples I pulled. You can track particular species. So this project I saw on the iNaturalist homepage, it is all UV fluorescent organisms. Somebody listed out all those species and wanted to see them worldwide. It could be species by location. So here, someone had created a project who I know, and it is all of the holly species. You could either do ilex like a whole genus, or they could do, which in this case includes all of them here, or they could just do the species itself, but they kept it to a geographical location, which in this case is Washington State. There's projects that you can track particular features. This one takes more intention, but it's still cool because it's an otherwise hard thing to track. But if you inform people about it, they can opt in on these projects and track these specific features like arthropod faces for whatever reason. And then also, it doesn't have to be all for work. For me, I am interested in invasive plant dyes personally, and this is a project I found that I'm learning about what other plants are good for dyes that are invasive geographically in different areas. And then also I can see where they're already growing, which if I need to emphasize another reason to be mindful of when you put public or obscured location, there's people like myself that I'm creeping around looking for these plants, and other people do that as well. So just being mindful of whenever you post observations, just to look at the stats that you're posting. So these projects are all broken into 3 different categories and 3 types of projects. So I'm going to talk through in a bit how to create a project, but the person who creates it, we're going to call the admin. They can add other people as admins as well, but they will control these parameters and then who can be part of it if they would like. The first type of project, and the main one, is going to be a collection project. I just see this as an auto filter. So in this one, this is where you just set the parameters, which could be the species, location, quality, and then anything that meets all of those parameters that you set, of those 228 million observations, filters it out, and they will show up in this project that you created. If you are making your first ever project, it is probably going to be a collection project, because that way you don't have to convince people to opt into it. It automatically uses the data that's there, and you can adjust it as appropriate. Next, we have a traditional project. This is the one that will be like the arthropod faces, because you outline the parameters in that project description. And then while anyone can join, often it's going to be people are inviting them to join these projects. And then they, in that observation field that we saw both in the iNat and Seek interfaces, or I guess just the iNat, they can self-select into these projects if it seems fit. So if somebody takes a lot of pictures of arthropods, they're in that arthropod faces project, and they have a picture of an arthropod face in their observation, they will just self-select into, yes, this is an arthropod face, and boom, it shows up on that project. And then lastly, we have our umbrella projects. And as you might have assumed, it just includes any other projects that you select, excluding other umbrellas. So first one I'm going to talk through is our big collection project. So again, we set parameters, and it just filtered from those 228 million observations into these. If you want to check the QR code, this is just so you can look through what that project page will look like. So I'm not going to go too in depth on it. I more so just wanted to note that we set these parameters, and already we have 39,303 observations. And we're not doing really intensive outreach, trying to get people to do iNat observations. These are things that are just happening. And this comes with the privilege of living in a city of people who care about nature. So being that this is the Seattle IPM group, This is a really useful tool for those of us here because there are a lot of people in Seattle who use INAT. So we didn't have to put in this work to get people to download an app like we used to have and submit observations. Instead, it just shows up. And it's pretty cool. But we also use collection projects for more than just tracking, because that one we just use as kind of a data set to see how things are distributed. You can look at it species by species. We also have special collection projects we've created for early detection, rapid response. Tom Earler from our team, I'll talk about him more, is very focused on this work. But early detection, rapid response, I'm sure a lot of you here are familiar, but EDRR, it's just the concept of trying to prevent problems from happening by detecting them early and then taking care of it early. And for weeds, we do that by seeing a species whenever it's first introduced and trying to keep it in check or control it before it can become a problem. And the way we do that is by having regulated weeds. So regulated weeds are just going to be this selected group of weeds from our weed list that they're going to be less widespread, and we think that we still have a chance of preventing them from being a problem because they're not very widespread, or maybe they're contained and we're trying to keep it that way or even eradicate them in some cases. This is how we're using this for EDRR, is that we have this project that our parameters here, instead of having those 300 plus species, we have these 63 selected species that are more rare. Our geography boundaries are still King County, but for here, we're also selecting the quality as research grade, meaning that multiple people have agreed on it, because these are kind of more serious reports that we're looking for. So you see the species at the bottom here. This is currently in order of what has the most observations, which is why you'll see tansy ragwort and poison hemlock right there at the top. But for using it for EDRR, you can also scroll all the way down to the bottom. And here we have these species that only have 1 or 2 observations. And this is a really cool way that you can use it for a preventative tool. Other ways you can explore your projects is that it will show up in map form. And then when you click on any of those dots, it will give you the information about this observation. Then you can go and look into the observation itself. So a really cool example I wanted to share was about bog bulrush, better known here as ricefield bulrush. So ricefield bulrush is a species that until this one, we had only seen it once in King County. And because we had this project set up and Tom in particular was monitoring it, we saw that Peter Zika, who's an associate with the Berker Barium, was at this existing restoration site, posted this observation, and it meant that come next year, even though Peter didn't intentionally put this as a report, we were looking at it closely. And by the next year, we were able to go out and tag the plants, make sure we confirmed the species. And then every year since, we've been going in and with other groups as well, taking care of it, using it as an education tool. But this is just one really cool example, in my opinion, of how we've been able to use the INAT collection projects for EDRR. The other type of project that I had mentioned, again, the arthropod paces, this is going to be a traditional project. This one is not automatic. You need to be a little bit more established in iNaturalist to create one technically. But the idea is that the creator will outline parameters, and then those who join are just expected to abide. From there, the admin can moderate the users and the observations and be like, no, this doesn't count. Way that we use it in King County Noxious Weeds is that we have a Noxious Seedlings and Seedlings of Interest project. This one tends to be a lot of our staff, but it's just a place that we can also just use it as a collection platform for images, particularly of weedy seedlings, because for early detection rapid response to be most effective, it's helpful to know what a species looks like when it's young. And this is now an available reference tool for anybody who wants to use it. But all that you need to do is that you just join the project by looking for it in iNaturalist, clicking join. And then once you do that, now next time you're posting an observation, there's this little projects bubble that we've been ignoring otherwise. You can just opt in. So for these traditional ones, that's my only one that I'm part of. You're opting in. These other collection projects, if it's a noxious weed, it's automatically going to show up on the regulated weeds project if it's regulated, the weeds and monitor lists otherwise, and any other projects that it automatically falls into. The traditional projects, you just have to opt in. And this is one that if you are in the field, I do recommend you joining it because while your other observations tend to show up, this is one that, again, we're looking for seedlings and seeds of noxious weeds and would appreciate any contributions. And the last type of project that I'm going to talk about is pretty straightforward. It's just an umbrella project. And the reason somebody would do this is just so that they can have all of their projects in one place. Key things here is that all of the observations will show up in this project from those selected projects, and that those overlapping ones only count once. So for instance, all of the King County regulated weeds observations are also showing up on that noxious weeds and monitor list project. So those kind of cancel out. And then the other thing is that the map of observations that you'll see will no longer abide to one project's bounds. It will include all of these project bounds, which in our case includes this general Pacific Northwest one, and then the Foxtail Grasses project, which includes a couple of states. And again, it cannot include other umbrella projects, but it can include any collection project or traditional project, whether or not it belongs to you. So it can also just be a tracking tool that maybe a project exists that you're interested in, or a number of projects, you can just put them into one place. Okay, now I'm going to talk about creating a collection project, and I do want to note that I'm not going to go super in depth on what you should put and where. I more so just want to show how easy it is to do, because I think that I've talked to a number of folks who are like, yeah, we want to create a project, and it could seem intimidating, but it's surprisingly easy. All you need is an iNaturalist account. I do recommend doing this from a computer, not a phone. And in general, the effectiveness is tied to the iNat use in your geographic region. Encourage people to use it, but noting that if you're in Seattle, there's already a lot of people using it. So that could be maybe you want to track the weeds in a specific park, or maybe you want to track a specific species. Whatever it is, you can now create that project. So first thing you're going to do, just go to inaturalist.org and make sure that you're logged in. From here, you are just going to click on Community, and then you will click on Projects. And that's just in that top search bar. That will bring you to this projects page. You just click Start a Project, and then here on this first slide, you'll be able to change a lot of these details later, because it's going to be things like your project name, as well as your project summary. Again, these are things that you can change. You can add icons, banners, all that customization, but really you just only need the name and summary to get started. And then these are going to be the three things that are hardest to change later on. So these are things that you want to be prepared for mentally or even physically. Project type, you're going to probably end up doing a collection project. Most people are. This is that auto filter. And then very importantly, I think it's very helpful to have your taxa picked out ahead of time, whether that's written out in a list. If you have specific species you want to track, being ready to have it by scientific name is really helpful, because one thing I will note about iNaturalist is that at the end of the day, it's a community science platform. There's a lot of common names around the world. You might have seen that tansy ragwort is just listed as ragwort. It's gone back and forth between tansy and ragwort, but never tansy ragwort. I don't know why. Scientific name is ideal in this situation. But also if you're just getting started and say you just want to track native plants or introduced plants, start on this step by just typing in plants. And I'll talk about what you'll do next. But otherwise, having the species ready, and then including places. This is going to be a geographic bounds thing, because if you just do the taxa, your project is going to show all of these observations worldwide, which is maybe what you want. But if you want to do, for instance, Seattle, Washington, or for us, King County, Washington, you're going to type it in here. If you can't find it, or maybe if you have like it's a specific neighborhood or a park or whatever, you can add a new place. I'd look up iNaturalist, adding a new place online. And typically you do need a more established profile, but from what I've read in the Reddit world of iNaturalist, which exists, is that you can usually email them and they're pretty responsive if you want to have a specific place added. And then the last thing is that I'm going to note is just exclude users. This is going to be because For things like our regulated weeds project, for instance, we as a staff all, for the most part, use iNaturalist. We're seeing a lot of these rare plants, and they're now showing up in our report systems. So in these projects, we have it so that any of our user profiles are excluded so that they're not showing up on our maps. Because if we're the ones reporting them, we already know about them. Don't need them as reports. Next thing will be just whether or not you want it to track as a group specifically for class projects and stuff. Sometimes they'll do this, but if you're just trying to gather as much of data as you can, I would not be checking this. And then the data quality, I will note what it means. So I usually don't include casual because that doesn't have to include photos, locations, or dates. Needs ID is a pretty good standard if you're just trying to track generally, but just noting that it might mean that you need to confirm the ID of some things because other people haven't already. So it could just be someone who confidently chose a species and it's wrong, or it could be just like a genus that might show up in there. And then lastly, research grade. This is one for our more serious projects like our early detection rapid response ones. We only select research grade because that has to include those photos, locations, date, and the ID has to be agreed upon by at least 2 different users. So that way our specialists aren't using their work time to go and check out a plant that hasn't been confirmed. And then in that first or second step, if when listing out taxa, you selected plants or something like that, this is whenever you could decide to choose native or introduced. It's going to be based on your geographic bounds. So you will have to have a geographic parameter in place. But if you just want to track, again, like the native plants in your park, this is a place to select that. And then last but not least, a good place to start with the date range is any. If you're just generally tracking, that's what we do on our general tracking project. But for our way that I'm about to focus on of how we're integrating this into our GIS systems, we're trying to track that as an annual thing. So we will have our base project, we duplicate it, but in our duplicating, the only thing we change is that we now add a time range, which is, if you've heard of BioBlitz, that is what these usually are. It includes this specific range of times, and we'll do it like January 1st to December 31st for any given year. And then lastly, I'm only explaining this one because I was confused at first. Essentially, whenever somebody joins a project, if somebody else posts something, they can say whether or not they want other members to be able to see their obscured locations. This is not saying that that will happen automatically. This is just giving people the option. So I usually check it, but totally up to you. So now you saw the project making it. Honestly, would take as long to create it as it took me to just talk there, depending on how many species you have. So I recommend it. But now I'm going to talk about how we are currently using our INAT project data that I went in on as a reporting system for noxious weeds. So this all to say that if you're ever like, how can I report noxious weeds in King County? Good news, just use iNaturalist. And if it's a species we're tracking, we'll be taking care of it. And if it is not, it'll at least still show up for the sake of community science. But just noting that also, if you're getting into this and it's about to seem like too much, you do not have to go and do all this GIS integration. We just started doing it, but we've had projects for several years now. Projects are a really solid place to start or even to end, depending on how serious you are about the tracking. I just wanted to show you the fact that if you use GIS, particularly field maps, or GIS in general in your work systems, this is how we found that you could integrate your INAT data into GIS so that you don't have to just always check on your project page. Okay, so what shows up as a weed report for us is going to be any of these qualifying observations from our regulated weeds project in any given year. So it's an annual thing. So it just reset for us on January 1st. So what we have is that we have these observations in iNaturalist, and then each of these observations that qualify from this year now show up in our maps. And this is what I mean. So for one, just noting that these 2 halves of the screen are from the same report. The left side is just showing iNaturalist, the right is showing our view using using ArcGIS. which you can either view here as I am on the computer or open it up on your phone in Field Maps. There's the same observation. You can tell because here we have the same username, it says the same species guess, same possible address and location as we noted at first, and very importantly, on our map side of things, it also includes the observation link. This is really helpful because whenever we're out in the field, we will go, you can look at the point, but by clicking on observation link, that's going to be what shows us these photos that we see on the left here, to where we could say, okay, wait, I see that tree over there, or like clicking on other photos, sometimes there'll be little landmarks. You're like, oh, there's that fence line. So it would have been here, but it's not here anymore. Just a helpful reference tool. And also if there's any notes. And then you might notice that on our map side of things, there's different colors. The way that we have it set up at the moment, which it is a work in progress, is that once my specialist is out there and they go to that location, it will start off red as needs verification. But if they've gone, they might say it's a new infestation. Or maybe on our maps, they already know about this infest and they don't even have to go out. They can just say existing infestation. And that's just how we use it. So what you will need, or what we used to connect INAP to our maps, is for one, that starter collection project that we have right here. This is just that KC regulated weeds one. And again, we just duplicated it and then set it to a specific 1-year timestamp. We also are using GIS because that's where we end up putting the data. We're using field maps so that we can use it in the field on our phones. And then to make these two talk, we're using Visual Studio Code, which is a Python coding platform. So very importantly, these things don't happen on their own. What you really need too is a Tom Earler or adjacent, really any committed specialist or person who is down to be the admin and monitor this, maybe even a couple of people you can share the responsibility. But while the initial setup is the biggest part, sometimes you do find quirks or new species are added or things change, and you need someone like Tom who can be there, who is just working on the iNaturalist side of things. And then also very importantly, you need a Mattia or adjacent. Mattia is our GIS coding savvy person, and he was the one who was able to get these things integrated in the first place. Things I will note is that if you even have like basic abilities in any of these platforms, Tom has agreed that he is interested and happy to talk to folks about setting up the more thorough part of projects. You can, of course, talk to me about more general project things. And then Mattia said he's happy to share the code with anyone who already has at least a basic understanding of coding. He doesn't want to do it for the groups, but he's happy to at least share the code and the information. So how it works, and this is going to be diving a little bit deep. It's just one slide. So if you are not a coding person, feel free to just glaze this over. I thought it was really interesting though, because essentially we're just facilitating a conversation between iNaturalist and GIS remotely by using this code. And this code is just telling GIS what to do. So essentially Python is saying, hey, iNat, we want your data to show up in GIS, but the iNat language is a little different than the GIS language. GIS does not speak fluent iNat. So we start off by extracting the iNat data, transform it, and we load it. So what that will look like is we extract the data from the selected project, we translate it into GIS, and then we load it and it shows up on our maps. Again, this is all happening in that Visual Code Studio place. But again, this is bringing the exact data over, and we have it set up to do this twice a week and only of new observations. So it shows up. And then further, we have that same layer show up in field maps, which that happens without the iNat either way. This is just one of many layers that we use. And how we use it in our fieldwork plans is that because this is just one layer of many that we have, our specialists can just toggle it on and say that they're already out in the field. So we tend to be looking for things like this symbol on the left. Here, my specialist is maybe coming out to look at this infest. They notice on the map this one's nearby. They pull it up, see it's the same species. They can look at the photo, see if it's in the same place. And if not, that's new information that they need to check this side of the water as well. But it also works well if they're just in the area and there's new species in places we haven't seen it before. And then how they use it in the field is that on field maps in their phone. They just can pull up, zoom in to wherever they are for the day, find that point and select it. And then again, looking at that observation link is really helpful information of where they might find the species, because while everything is in the field map side of things, the photos tend to be helpful. And then when they're ready, they can just say that they saw it by going and editing this point. They can move it around as needed, verify the date, and then this is when they will update the symbology by just saying whether or not it's new, existing, or updating the point. So if they mark it as new, they just know that later on in the season they will go back, look at all those blue points, and put those now into our database officially. And last but not least, how we use this as outreach, because that is my neck of the woods. For one, for on-noxious weeds, it works as tracking. I think motivation is really important in our work, and giving people the option to contribute, because it's always hard when people are like, how can I help? And I'm like, and they're like, you want to know about all of the blackberry and ivy in Seattle? And I'm like, no, but this gives the chance so that folks can opt to do this report, and then maybe other groups will be using it as well. You can also communicate with reporters directly in the comments, so it's kind of like a social media for naturalist nerds. And then last but not least, we use this portion called observation fields. Again, particularly Tom does, to where in the actual observation itself, if you want to add anything else, he created these fields that he can go to any of the observations and just do a drop down, look up whether or not it is, well, he knows its legal status, and he can just let people know if it's legally required or not. So that way, if it's on private land, people maybe start taking care of it or try to work with us on it. And then if it's on public land, at least they know that we saw their reports, and then now they can link to the webpage and learn more. But that is all I got. Again, my name is Sky. If you have any weeds questions, INAT, phone ID, feel free to reach out. Tom is great for iNaturalist, like thorough questions. And then for any GIS script things, that's going to be Mattia. Thank you so much.
That is so cool. Thank you, Sky.
Thanks so much, Sky. That was a wonderful presentation, very informative. Yeah, a couple of questions here. The first one, and it seems like this may have been answered, but are any of these maps good or are any of these apps good for mapping plants?
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that was answered, but yeah, just to clarify, yes, you can really do any plant species or general plants.
Great. And then Margaret Wagner with Kent Parks would like to know, Sky, have you already turned these slides into a PDF that we could share with teachers or partners looking into a group to the app? If no, would you be open to me turning your slides into something like that?
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Feel free to email me, and depending on like which parts you're interested in, I could just turn this into a PDF. If you wanted all of them, some of them I use a lot of layering, so I'll just need to separate those out, but happy to.
And our in-house Steve Soshi wants to know, do you think there's a danger of becoming a plant nerd if you use this technology?
Oh, 110%. Honestly, it's like the gateway to plant world. It's how I got into it personally.
Yeah. Any sense of how often you or your team comes across research grade observations that are incorrectly ID'd?
Yeah, so there's not an actual stat on that, but a flaw that we noticed is that things can be marked as research grade because they've had two people agree on them. And there's been occasional times that it's just fully wrong. And even if it gets corrected, it still shows up on our maps because we don't have a way that it detracts from the maps now. We just have a way that the new things are added. But in those cases, it's few and far between enough that I still think it's an effective tool and still use it.
Okay. What are some of the common mistakes or pitfalls to look for when using these apps?
Yeah, so one is definitely going to be the fact that it's going to be based on your locality. So my experience of using iNaturalist out here in Seattle versus when I've gone to like Eastern Washington or when I was in Minnesota for a conference, it's very different in terms of its like effectiveness. So I think a pitfall is just being aware that it's best to use, it's like IPM in the terms of like using the right tools for the right place. So maybe when you are in a more obscure place, using the iPhone or using the Google options for your basis of plant ID and then putting those into the database. Because if you think it's weird and it should be working, because you have a clear photo with a flower, it probably should, but you might be in a place that doesn't have as much data. So just trying to use a combination of tools and not relying on just any one.
Great. Does adding your name to reports help you determine whether or not a sighting is accurate? Example, if you know a weed specialist has reported a weed versus a regular citizen sighting, would a different approach be taken?
If it's for, well, if it's a weed specialist, think of words. Yes, I think it's helpful to have at least a hint to your name on there if you are reporting in your local area. But that said, it's also no pressure because this is at the end of the day still a newer tool to us. So we don't always respond to folks necessarily like in the way of, hey, thanks for your report. Instead, it'll just be confirmed by Tom or someone else adding that observation field. And then just kind of assuming we're doing follow up. And if people really want follow up, they're always welcome to reach out to us. But you can put your name on there, but it's up to you.
Great, thank you. And then if the script that runs a week, twice a week, and only brings in new observations, how do observations that have been changed or corrected in INAT get incorporated in field maps? Or is that not an issue because they only become new observations in the project after all verification has happened?
Yeehaw. Okay. So I have the answer in my head. Let me just put the words in right. So that is, again, this is something that we're starting to figure out. Oh, Tom actually just wrote in the chat. We have Tom here.
Oh, great.
Where did it just go? Tom might have actually just answered that. We're actually running 2 scripts as of this week, one for new things and one for changing things. Great.
Thanks, Tom.
Yeah.
All right. Well, again,
Awesome.
we appreciate your presentation, and yeah, it was wonderful, very informative. Just one last, if there's any other apps that are out there that you think might be helpful for people to identify, maybe trees or mushrooms, or are you just solidly an INAT?
So I have used PlantNet, which I've noted people have put in there. I think PlantNet is helpful because you can select which features you're showing. So it requires you to have like a leaf photo at least, but then you can choose one and recognize that you want it to look at how it's growing or its habit, or choose one and recognize that you want it to look at its flower. And then you can choose the database based on your location yourself. I think that one's a pretty helpful tool. I've used that out of desperation when all the other ones haven't worked because it's effective. I just don't personally use that database as much. So if I had to choose, I end up using INAT. And then for mushrooms, my mushroom people out here might know, but there is a specific mushroom app that I paid for at some point that is really helpful because it has you look at the specific parts of the mushroom. Because I think the niche tools are helpful because, like, for instance, mushrooms, you want to look at the gills, you want to look at the top and from the side, and it asks you to
Yeah.
put in those specifics so it looks at those specific things. Yeah.
Awesome.
Great.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Sky. And also thank you so much to our previous speakers, Jamie Lim of Seattle Parks and Recreation and Aaron Anderson of the Xerces Society. Also a big shout out and thank you to all of the folks on this IPM webinar committee. So Bridget Kelsch, our chair, thank you, Bridget, Steve Sosi, Mark Malone, Jacob de Guzman, Cece Miller, and I'm on it too. Thanks to all of you guys for joining us today. Again, today was the second of a 3-part series for the City of Seattle IPM webinar series. The last and final one will be held on Thursday, March 20th. Later, Bridget will be sending out a link to the recording and any other shared information when it becomes available. I do want to highlight that when you leave the webinar today, you will just automatically land on a feedback survey, which Bridget has worked to make shorter. So it's only 11 questions, 11 short questions. So if you guys can fill that out, even just partially, that would be super helpful for our committee as we plan these future webinars. I do want you to know that it's anonymous and it's super helpful. So thank you. We hope to see you on March 20th and enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. It's beautiful out there today. Thank you, Sky.